And we'll actually have folks here attending. So. Alex Mike for the industry map. Provide technical assistance to you all. Okay. But you have your hand up. Did you? I just want to see.
I see that chat's been, I think, disabled purposefully. Just so you know, at least I, and maybe Diane could nod and let us know, I can't hear anything now. And it's also cutting out. It's like, so it's not just soft, it's also broken up.
Agreed.
Okay. Pause for 1 second. Thank you, Liz. Let's pause 1 second. Yeah. You're on mute, right? Yeah.
Judy, can you mute? Are you muted?
There we go. Try that. Um, all right. Can people how can people hear us now? Turn your volume to 0. Okay. I think it is. It's you.
Better. The feedback just stopped. Could someone say something again? Now nothing.
Yeah, we were wondering whether
Oh.
it was because Jane's computer was like a unidirectional mic or something, only picking up Jane.
Hmm.
I'm paying attention, but getting tea, so that's why I'm off camera. Sorry, if I had the chat, I'd let you know, but I'm here.
Diane, can you hear us?
Yes, I can
Oh.
hear you.
All right.
Okay. All right. Let's give this a try. We know this is going to be frustrating. Well, let's start with introductions. You can see how it goes.
Adam Sherman with VESC.
Hi, I'm Richard Hopkins. I'm live in Middlebury. I'm with the Climate Economy Action Center of Addison County, and I'm a retired epidemiologist.
Colin Smythe from the Agency of Natural Resources.
Megan Mitchell, also from the Agency of Natural Resources.
Chase Whiting, Conservation Law Foundation.
Jane Lazarchuk with the Agency of Natural Resources.
Charlie Hancock, I'm a project consulting forester out of Montgomery.
Judy Dow from the document.
Patrick Fields, facilitator, and I think our only working group, task group member is Liz on the phone. Is that right, Jane?
Yes.
Liz,
Hi.
this introduction.
Here I am thinking I was the closest to the meeting and I'm not there because COVID's in the household. So I really apologize, but you're glad I'm not there for that reason. So I'll participate remotely and sorry, I'm missing you all in person.
Great, Liz, thanks for joining. And why don't we do introductions in the room? So.
Okay, I'm Leah Summerfield. I work at the document with Judy. Cheryl Jorgensen, just a local ecologist.
Great, welcome. Thank you for having us. All right, on the phone, why don't we go with, I can't say everybody's name, but Amber, you want to name and affiliation?
I'm just listening. Amber Widmer from DED.
Great, Jade? Got it. Steve Crowley?
Yes, hi, Steve Crowley from Vermont Sierra Club.
Great, Ryan Patch?
Hello, good morning. My name is Ryan Patch with the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets.
Great, Brian?
Good morning, Brian Woods, Agency of Natural Resources, Climate Action Office.
Betsy? Okay, and then I can't see the names of other folks, so Megan, can you actually call on the 2 people whose names I can't see?
Sorry.
That's it, I think. That's it.
Oh,
Betsy, couldn't get myself unmuted. Betsy Lesnickowski, Burlington Electric, just listening in.
Okay.
and then TJ.
TJ just showed up, great.
Okay.
All right. Okay, good. All right, Jane is. Hey,
Hi,
TJ, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry.
Hi, DJ Bohr from the Department of Public Service and co-chair of the Cross-Sector Mitigation Committee.
Great, thanks, TJ. All right, so Jane is talking to technical services as we speak, so hang tight 1 second.
It sounds like it's working okay.
Well, it'll talk me through that.
Bear with us, sorry.
Okay. I'll look at that. Okay, thank you. Thanks so much.
All right, what's the news on the?
She said on the hayloft guide, there's like the active to call to access the phone, and there's a post pin. I don't know.
Maybe if yours is working okay, maybe we just go.
Yeah, I think unless we have an issue.
I have officially a let it.
That doesn't really make sense to me.
It does,
Just
shoot,
go
I
with
was
what we-
Yeah.
Okay, so there's two, I think there's probably 2 or 3 things we want to get done today. I think first and foremost, we want to keep working through the recommendation section. And Jane's gonna pull it up in a second. We'll look at that both on screen and for folks on Zoom, be able to see that. Then secondly, we pulled together kind of 2 opening paragraphs, trying to kind of construct some language that we both talk a little bit about process and a little bit about substance, while recognizing, that can be a challenge to do. So we've done that. So we'll go through that second as assuming we get recommendations. Third, then we want to just touch base about what to do with findings. The thing is a little more complicated to figure out what to do with, given the complexity of getting it done with citations and the accuracy that the group would want. And then 4, we can just talk about process with the Climate Council. And then at noon, we do want to stop, and I think we want to do a bit of walking tour of the neighborhood, if that's correct, Jane.
Yes.
So that is our plan for this one. Richard.
Neighborhood or the internet?
Just the interview, just.
Sorry.
I want to make a request. If somebody could give me a lift back to downtown Burlington when we're done, I would appreciate it. Somebody who's perhaps not going on that tour. You're not? Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it.
Only if you're good, Richard. Only if you're good.
Well, if I'm bad, I'll walk. It's okay.
Yeah, no, if you're not good,
There we go. Good trouble, I love it. Okay. All right, so Jane, do you want to pull up, I guess we need to approve the minutes of the October 26th meeting. So any additions or corrections to those minutes?
They really just always point to the video, so it should be pretty straightforward.
Okay, any additions or corrections? Otherwise, we'll consider them approved. And around 10:30 and around 11:30, we'll make time for public comment, give or take out of how we're doing, just getting through the work. And otherwise, I think we do want to focus the conversation just among the task group, except for public comment. So that'll be folks here at the table, as well as Liz on the phone. Liz, if you want to speak, just raise your hand with the Zoom raise hand. And then if I miss it, any of the groups say, hey, Pat, Liz's hand is up, just remind me, because sometimes I get caught up and miss it. Okay.
That sounds
Thank
great,
you.
thank you.
Is that okay, Liz? Okay, thanks a lot. All right, we're gonna focus this, and then can we make it bigger?
Asking a lot here.
And maybe
Just
both
acknowledge that we're letting.
on Jane's computer, and there we go. Okay, that's good.
Okay.
All right. So I think we had a few remaining questions on 2, but I think we have to come back to in terms of of kind of an explanation or rationale, which we were discussing how to do. So I think we were on 3, and I'm trying to remember. I think we want to kind of focus on 3 forward, and we'll come back to 2 after we look at the opening paragraphs. But on 2, that we were trying to figure out kind of how to start the paragraph. And so we had, I think, a proposal for that language you see right there on screen on number 3. So we need to kind of see with the group where the group is regarding that red line right there. I don't think we really closed that conversation. So with that, Richard.
Without taking a position on the substance of it, as a scientist, I object to saying we're gonna advocate something for something by doing a study of it. Okay, that's not logical.
Yeah, I would second that.
So Richard, would you fix that by just saying,
I would make it two separate items.
and you just give the language fix if you could.
I would just say,
Just end
end
after the
after the word replacement, stop and start a new number 4.
And then an evidence-based study would help inform that phase out, essentially, that's the idea.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Would you say something like to start it with like to do so?
I think to inform the phase out maybe or something like that. I think the purpose of the study was to understand the consequences.
Carry out. Yeah. Thank you.
Nope, thanks, Richard. All right, so I want to test that first. Now that I think we've got the more clear as Richard wisely advocated for, I want to test that first sentence to see if people can or can't live with that. Does not speak to when, it speaks.
Yeah, so the time component is one that kind of, that's where I would question, is there a time component to this in terms of, and I get that this and what we're talking about below is connected, but independently of each other, that recommendation not having a time component or anything tied to it, I understand splitting them makes sense, but I also think that first sentence is so integrally tied to the second one that I still go back to the question of, we're talking about a study, but we're also already talking about advocating for an end.
There's a few ways, Charlie, I'm not sure this will be satisfactory. There's a few ways you could handle that. One is if we have the first and the second piece, then we can get rid of the if part in the middle of that paragraph. But you could say that, should advocate for phasing out, however, the group did not determine the time period or something. You could add a caveat around if we haven't really determined the time period. I'm just actually, we might, but I'm just suggesting for Charlie's concern.
I agree, the removing of the if is kind of the crux of it, because it implies that that's up in the air. But if we're advocating for the phase out, it implies that it's a foregone conclusion.
Just because I want to make one comment on process real quick. So today's meeting, there are some participants of the broader subcommittees of jurisdiction on the call today, from Ag and Eco in particular and cross sector. I just wanted to highlight that for all of those members who are participating, we're still trying to reach consensus amongst the task group on the language of the recommendations. Subcommittee members were invited to participate to sort of have a better understanding of the thought process from the task group today and see into the discussion. But next week's meeting, which will be highly focused on subcommittee review and input on those recommendations in order to more broadly inform a consensus document that lifts up to the council. We're hopeful that today the task group will reach near consensus on a draft to carry forward to the subcommittees. And the subcommittees will have a long period of time next week to have input and discussion about how they influence these recommendations. So just want to highlight that, since I know folks are unclear on the process for subcommittee review, and some of them are listening in today. So
Jane, just clarification on that. And what we forward to the Climate Council needs to be advised and considered by the subcommittees. The subcommittees themselves need to reach consensus on the recommendations before they go to the council.
I don't feel like that was really clearly articulated by the council, unfortunately. We can bring it, we have a steering committee meeting on Monday and I can ask that, but I think the understanding and expectation was that the subcommittees themselves are quite diverse and large, and the intent was this task group would represent them, but there was a need for formality in the process to make sure that subcommittees had a chance to weigh in and carry them forward. I expect that consensus will be hard to reach across subcommittees, and I'm not sure that is a realistic expectation, but would be one that would be great if we could get there.
I just want to be clear about it, because I do think that it's a challenging enough task for this task group to reach consensus on the language, and then to have it go through yet another cycle before it gets into council, I think would be a pretty high hurdle.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably worth, I guess, clarification for the council next week.
Is there any recommendation from every subcommittee go through
A second for.
Well, this isn't a subcommittee, but yes, the transportation task group was a joint task group, and they actually then brought their recommendations back to the cross-sector subcommittee, which was the committee of jurisdiction in that space, and had to wrestle and change language with that subcommittee's input.
So should we bring this back to Ag and Eco?
We are next week, and they were invited today to listen in so they could hear everybody's thought process, which is why I believe Diane, Ryan, and TJ, some folks have chosen to participate today, but I know next week it's a priority for subcommittee members to join and weigh in. And the two subcommittees that I've really reached out to highlight that is Ag and Eco. And I know Abby, Billy, they'll all be there next week, Lauren, David, and then weren't able to join this week. So they'll just play more catch up next week.
And it's Ag and Eco, we have actually 3 subcommittees, right? Ag and
Four.
Four. So we
Yeah.
have cross-sector, Ag and Eco, data.
And just transitions. But the two committees of like real substance around recommendations have been Ag and Eco and cross-sector.
So I have a question about the first sentence. If we're going to advocate for a phase out of wood biomass and not give a date, why are we doing it in other areas for other things? Like by such and such a date, people will have an electric car. By such and such a date, X will happen. Why are we not doing that here?
I don't think we have that for electric vehicles. I know we just have dates around increase of market share, but there's no requirement to buy an electric vehicle. And this
It's
is
a suggestion, right?
Yeah.
So why don't we have a suggestion in here?
I guess my take on that would be that I mean, we could put out a date, but I think that the study that we're asking to be commissioned would be what would inform the date. So,
Well, I think that would be true about other things too.
So I
well,
think-
yeah. I mean,
I guess the question I'm gonna pose to the group, can we reach agreement on a date from the task group? I think certainly the study says if we were to win, if it'd be win it now. But if I mean, the one way to test this is to suggest a date and see what the group thinks.
So I'd say I'm not comfortable putting a date on it. I think if we're gonna be talking about, I still have trouble with this in concept that we're putting forward an end statement and asking for a study on it. And I agree with the broad principle that I think, yeah, eventually we want to move towards different sources of energy, and I agree with that. But
Consensus, Charlie, is to agree with the group for the group to move forward.
yeah. And so I think, but I think where I am is I agree with the broad principle we're laying out here about this transition. I just think that the language we use is really important, and I don't think we have the language right.
Is it the opening statement that you have?
Yeah, the opening statement and how it ties to the studies. So again, I go back to, if we break them up, then we've got 2 different statements. One informing the other. I mean, my preference would be to keep this actually as one paragraph, one recommendation. And I kind of liked how it was written before in terms of, commissioning the study to inform the eventual phase out of. Because I think that's where, at least I'm at in terms of, and I think in that statement, we are saying that we would like to see an eventual phase out. And we're looking at the study to inform what that would look like.
Yeah, I disagree with that because we've already heard from so many people how important it is to phase it out, and we have to state that.
And okay, I guess from my perspective, I think then saying that we want a study to basically tell us how to do that, from my perspective, is saying that we.
Yeah, well, that.
Well, Colin may have an idea for options.
Well, I'm not sure, but could we say that the date will be informed by the study? That be?
It says when, if, when, and how.
Oh, later.
So I think that's in there.
You can look at that, and also Jane just highlighted that last sentence, which does talk about the study should clearly look at the timeline of phase out and the intended ramp up. So that language is in there for addressing the time.
I would point out that the if contradicts
Yeah,
the
yeah,
first
that's-
sentence. And if we do want the scope of the study to include if, then we delete that first sentence.
So
Or delete
Or
if.
vice versa.
I want to try
But
strike.
we can't have it both ways.
Let's try to strike out if. So I want to just, again, we can discuss whether or not we include a timeframe in there. I'm not hearing among this group necessary agreement at this point, but I want to just test the proposition up front, see if we can do this or not. So I mean, I think if the group can, I'm curious if the group can live with the, essentially wordsmithing we can futz with in a bit, but I'm wondering whether the group can live with three, in terms of the general intent, we're going to make a proclamation should be phased out, and then we do a study to understand the implications for when and how. And I'm curious if people can live with that generally. We can futz with the wording a little bit more, but I'm curious, Adam, if you could live with that general principle. Yes, to phase out, study or reform.
I had no problem with the removal of if. I think the plants are 40 years old and it's kind of implied that they'll be phased out, but I can go along with saying that they should be phased out. I mean, it's only saying the inevitable. Plants don't last 60 years.
Yeah, but they're talking about expanding, so.
Richard, how about you?
I'm fine.
Megan? Charlie?
You're asking about just the first sentence?
Well, I think we're we can fuss with the exact language, but essentially making a proposition, yes, they should be phased out and need a study to understand the when and the how.
So the only question I've got is, and this, I don't know if we answered this last time or not, but I know that the questions have been brought up. I think Liz was one too that brought it up about biomass electricity generation and whether or not we wanted to be more specific about that in terms of cogen or other applications.
What did we do on one? Let's go look at one. Let's look at one.
Did we resolve that?
I think we electrical led generation was the terminology that we used.
Should we mirror that in this
We
sentence?
can mirror that. Okay, so Charlie, I think all right, so if we do that, electricity led, tier one, what do you think about the general proposition?
Or just to name the plants like we did.
Just name the two.
Just name like it.
Yeah, general proposition I'm okay with. I still am not 100% comfortable with the time element of what we're talking about and what conditions would essentially need to be met to do this.
Well, you just turned it over, those consensus, those agreements, you just turn them over to the study.
Yeah.
Agreeing to this.
Yeah, so I think that some of that gets at the text below that we haven't gotten to talk about yet. So
Yeah,
I
well,
think if we
I'm
can-
not okay with it because of the same reason, time. I think time should be in there.
So Judy, you would, in order for you to be able to live with it, you'd want to add some kind of date or time, correct? Okay. And Liz, how about you?
Yeah, I think the conversation has passed me by. I was back 5 or 6 minutes ago agreeing with Charlie. I support the original language that we had with the putting a study in place for the if, when, and how. I am not a consensus member of the current language.
Okay. All right. So we do not have consensus on this language. So what we either have to do is acknowledge, I think I have a general sense the group agrees to the idea of the study. I think the question is, what's the purpose of the study? Is the purpose of the study a when and how? Is the purpose of the study an if, when and how? And then, and I think that's the challenge. And then if we were actually, I'm hearing Liz say maybe she can't even live with kind of the proposition about phase out. We got the language closer to right.
So there are two levels that we're talking at here, I think. One level says, we think that burning wood to make electricity is bad from a climate point of view. And that's the most important thing to us.
No.
No, we're not.
Keep learning.
The other kind of level is to say, we think that there are greenhouse gas implications of continuing to run biomass electric plants, but we think other factors are more important. That's what you would have to conclude. If the if part was operative, you have to say, we know it's bad for the climate, but but other factors are more important to us. And so we'll make our savings in greenhouse gases somewhere else in our society. We'll do a better job with vehicles, or we'll do a better job with buildings, or we'll do a better job with farming in order to accommodate the fact that we want to continue to burn wood for this plant. That's what the if side says to me.
Yeah, well, to me, the burning electricity for the purpose of it's bad for the climate, that whole section you said in the beginning, that's not primarily, it's bad for people living in this state. It's a health hazard, and we've heard that. That's the primary reason for me.
Judy, I've heard you very clearly on that. I've said in the margins before that if I were the Vermont Department of Health, I would want to be part of this conversation. Okay, and I would be unhappy if some task group elsewhere in state government assigned me a job of doing a study without my having an opportunity to participate in the development there. This is not based on any conversation with anybody, any actual person in the Vermont Department of Health. It's based on my experience working in 5 different state health departments and how I would likely react.
And that makes sense, that they would be included, but if the primary reason is not, to me, it's not climate change. The primary reason is the health of the people, and that the repercussions of wood burning on climate change is gonna impact the health of those people.
And again, I think there are multiple reasons why this group as a whole, not individually, have stated concerns about these plants. One very important was when Judy has noted, there's also the cultural resource impact of the physical plant itself. And then there's obviously the greenhouse gas pieces, which has been the a sort of party discussion around all those implications here. So again, I think we can acknowledge that the drivers might be different for different members here. The question is, do you reach the same conclusion? And right now, I don't think we have reached the same conclusion, at least on the if question.
Well, we're in a crisis because of the climate, right? And we know there's a crisis in health. So I would want the study to be sooner than later. I wouldn't want our verbiage to be something that could lead people to drug this on for 20 years.
Well, one security to that point, there's one thing where the group could live with their own timing, which is essentially to advance immediately.
That's what I was just gonna say.
Yeah, it's Jane, sorry, because that, to your point, Jane, at least on the study, we need to be clear. It's not like when you get around to it.
Right.
So was the timing question on the closing of or phasing out of the plants, or was the timing issue on commissioning and launching the study?
Well, both of them.
Okay, I just want to make sure that the timing issue has come up, and those are 2 different things. So we should just be clear.
Yeah, I think as far as, I agree with Judy that for the study, like, yeah, we should do that right now, not wait on that. And I think that to me is like where my roadblock is, or my mental block, because I do think there's things that need to get figured out in order to actually say, yes, now's the time to do that. And I'm not comfortable until those are figured out, saying something other than kind of an aspirational, yes, we know this is something we want to get to. I mean, but there's things that need to get figured out before that can happen.
Jason.
I'm just curious to know what those things would be. Like, could we start to name them in concrete terms? Because we know that the climate crisis has progressed to a point at which the window of opportunity that we have to make the reductions necessary to sustain the life on this planet has gotten extraordinarily small and shrinking. We are literally running out of time. And so if we're going to sort of put up things that would prevent or delay action, I think we should become very concrete about what we're talking about, so this isn't abstract, because there will come a point very soon at which we won't have the opportunity to go back and make changes that we wish that we had made. So I think we should get real clear. So what are those things that you need to consider? What are the sort of potentials that would impact if we should reduce greenhouse gas emissions from biomass? What are those things?
So for me, the main questions that I've got are around just electricity generation, power. I mean, this is not my wheelhouse, like, but just if those get shut off, what's getting shut on, turned on to replace that? How does that work with current infrastructure? You know, everything there. And then the other question that I've got is, and this is, I mean, so it's selfish or just the lens I look at this through from one perspective is if we do eventually turn off those markets for that kind of material, have we brought in replacement markets for it that can essentially absorb that transition? And I look at some of that as a potential, like, are there opportunities there for market transitions to products that are not, you know, climate impactive? Because I think if you were to talk to like the forest community, like I'll use the working lands economy, that's probably the not right way to phrase it, but I don't think the question of like where that material ends up going is a huge deal, right? Like if that logger or that processor can send it to a plant that makes wood cellulose insulation, like great, let's do that. But where my comfort level gets really touchy is like, until we're sure what that landscape's gonna look like, I do worry about impacts that can kind of domino backwards into that industry, which is already really on a really fine tipping point with how to manage that kind of material in the scope of forest management. We can talk about different kinds of forest management, what's good, what's bad, what we want to see, but markets for that material are critical to practicing forest management in a broad context. And so that's kind of personally where I want to make sure we're on sure ground with a plan moving forward there, so that basically we come out on all ends in the place we want to be.
So I think that makes a lot of sense. I agree. And I see down towards the bottom, beginning the fourth line from the bottom to the hand on the far right side, and the alternative revenue streams and the produce for rural working economy. I'm wondering if we can make this more concrete, and we can, in some way, because it would be part of this study, part of the investigation, but maybe we can bring more things into it. For example, we could name, I'm getting out over my skis, I'm looking at this state employees here. I believe that there are opportunities with state funds with programs such as Veggie to potentially invest in, I'm seeing, but ideas such as this. If there's any way that we could make this more concrete by specifically saying, these are the concrete steps that we could take to explore what those alternative streams would be, and here are the ways that we could support the creation of those alternative streams. If, for example, a facility were to phase out because of, it becomes financially insolvent or otherwise, whether planned or not, there could be opportunities for that facility to be retrofitted, as in Madison.
Yeah.
And there could be concrete steps to be taken to investigate that type of careful planned approach that perhaps then could meet those alternative markets. So I'm wondering if there's opportunity in here where we can make this stronger, clearer, and meet that interest, because I hear you, and I think at its core, that's the hard work of a just transition. That's what we're going to have to do to ensure that we are transitioning, but also doing something that brings people along.
So Chair, I want you to consider, if you want to respond to Jason about the specific language suggestions, or to think about it, then I can go with you. So.
No, I mean, I agree, and I do think that, I mean, I think my comfort level would increase if that can be more explicit in there with those concrete steps about, market opportunities, things like that. I'd have to sit down and play with words for a bit to come up with language, so.
So we could flag that then as an area, and we can think about it maybe in the back of our heads and circle back to it.
So maybe just further note, like just if wood doesn't flow, it's not a spigot, you can't turn it on and off. If you close one plant, that workforce goes away. And 10 years later, if a new wood fiber cellulose plant opens up, you can't just turn that spigot back on. So I think if that's the kind of the essence of what we're talking about here, and just flag it in a note, just saying, you lose this,
yeah,
it doesn't.
And I guess for context, I mean, where my brain goes is to like, when the Pixel mill in Maine blew up, literally blew up. I mean, that sent shockwaves through most of New England in terms of market flows, what things could happen, how things, I mean, and I get that we're not strictly focused on the economy and there's other, things that we have priorities. And I agree with your comment, Chase, that like we're on borrowed time here. But I do want to make sure that transitions are thought out in that way. And so that's where I get a little bit kind of concerned about kind of immediacy language built into certain aspects without the context to back them up in terms of how this works. Because like you said, when things get shut off, in the case of things exploding, we're just getting shut down, and that has real impacts in people's lives, livelihoods, rural communities, those kinds of things.
James' response on it.
Yeah, and this isn't so much a response, more just sort of building on this thought. I'm wondering what happens if, for example, Connecticut decides that it's not going to treat wood biomass as rec eligible, as Massachusetts is doing. And so Vermont loses a market that makes these plants financially, valuable. And so perhaps then they close anyways. Or, what happens if, as Adam was saying, we get to a 60, 50 period of time in which plants just can't operate anymore. The reason I bring these uncertain possibilities forward is because I think if we don't make a plan, then we could be stuck in a situation in which we have something that's sort of like that explosion that you described, where an event could trigger then a real market issue.
Yeah.
Whereas if we start to plan now, identifying ways to have alternative revenue streams, and we start planning and pushing those forward, I think we can be insulating ourselves against those types of risks. And so I wonder if this is actually like an important step that we should be taking sort of regardless.
Yep.
Okay, Charlie, go ahead.
I just want to also just flag the other part of my comment. This is again not my wheelhouse, but I don't feel like I have an understanding that there is a viable plan, a viable route in place now to basically make that switch. Where's the power going to come from that we need? I think conceptually we know what we want to move to, what sources we want to move to, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't know kind of what that would be, what the time frame would be. And this gets at the study question, but I do. That's my other area of kind of uncertainty is how do we switch? And the other thing is this is all happening in a broader context of trains are already moving. I mean, they're looking to build a new transmission line down through Eastern Franklin County to bring more power from Hydro-Quebec down into the state.
More renewables though.
So Charlie, to your point, I think what's missing in this paragraph that concerns everybody. I think we haven't really talked about kind of the replacement and that even though we called it out elsewhere in language we wrote out, it's not actually called out specifically here. So the study probably needs to mention that. How would we frame it? So we probably should just mention something about kind of the question of blood replacement. Judy, I want you guys.
Yeah, I do. I want to comment to a couple of things Charlie said.
Yeah.
First off, it's not just the rural working economy. There's a lot of migrant workers that live in the cities.
Yep.
There's a lot of people who work right here, who live right here, who work everything. So I think it's wrong to use the word rural working economy. The second thing I have a question.
Judy, just if we don't use rural working kind of what would you different phraseology we should use?
Working economy. I mean, it's everybody, right?
Yeah.
There's 40 employees here. And there's 25 or 21 at Rite Aid.
Yep.
And I believe that would all live near there.
Yeah, and my comment wasn't to be exclusive of anybody else. It was more that my comments were specific to that one demographic.
Yeah, and I agree that we
Yeah.
need to consider these people. We just can't consider them rural. That's all. We have to just consider people working there.
Yeah.
My other comment is, you said several times.
Just people are saying they have a hard time hearing you specifically. Just so you
Let's
know.
pull it up. Go ahead.
So the first comment was taking rural and making it more neutral so that it impacts everybody. And I totally agree with what you're saying. The other one, and I may be misunderstanding this, but I thought I've heard on several occasions, McNeil was not providing electricity for Burlington. They were selling it out of state because it was cheaper to get it from Hydro-Quebec. And so they were able to keep the cost of electricity down for Burlingtonians because they bought it from Hydro-Quebec rather than shipping, rather than using it. So the comments about where the power is going to come from is non-existent if they're not even using the power in Burlington.
Yeah, I guess that gets at the broader question in terms of the fluxes in power distribution load, what's going where. And I wasn't necessarily kind of like where are the people in Burlington going to get their electricity from. It was more my broader not quite understanding what you're pointing out. Like the idea that none of the power there is actually being, this is where my knowledge of power supply. Like,
Well, I may be misunderstanding, but that's what I thought.
Yeah, can we clarify electricity? So I just want to take a broad statement and clarify. So I want to make a distinction between essentially the functionality of the physical system versus the purchasing of power.
Yes.
In the functionality of the system, when any load, whether it's, doesn't matter how it's produced, wind, gas, whatever, it goes into the transmission system and the electrons are not traceable. So in other words, it's in the system, but I want somebody who knows more than I to correct that. There is a different accounting, however, when people go to purchase their power, and it's not about the exact electrons, it's the way that kind of the accounting gets handled about who buys power from whom. But I want someone to correct what I just said, just we're really clear about how electricity functions.
Electrons flow wherever they're needed, and electrons from McNeil go to, citizens of the city. So RECs get sold elsewhere. So like electrons, RECs do different things, so it's not complete.
But neither of those tells you where the carbon dioxide is going, nor where the PM 2.5 is going.
That's correct.
Right.
Yes, and in fact,
That's correct.
and in fact, with the PM 2.5, the impacts are localized right here, while the financial aspects of it accrue to people in different states. I mean, this is sort of like the textbook example of external.
But I could just pick up on that. For 100 years or more, Vermont has been doing that to everybody else.
It doesn't make it right though, right?
No,
Two
no,
wrongs don't make it right.
No, exactly. But for 100 years or more, Vermont has been buying coal-powered and fuel oil-powered electricity from plants elsewhere in the Northeast, and has had virtually no generating capacity of its own within the state. McNeil and Reigate are two exceptions, but we don't have and haven't had coal-fired power plants supplying Vermont's power needs. We've been putting the air pollution off on the people of Boston and New Haven and Albany and Rochester, wherever the power was being generated that Vermont was buying. And Vermont, 100 years ago, Vermont invested in hydroelectric, and the capacity that was built then is still there. But it provides only a tiny proportion of the power that we consume.
Judy had one more comment, then I'll go to Liz. Judy, go ahead.
I'd like to just say one more thing. I spent Saturday with folks from Quebec and talking about Hydro-Quebec. Hydro-Quebec is now looking at how they pass power to us differently, and they want to be more sustainable. So they're not just looking at hydro anymore, they're now looking at wind. And so when they're taking indigenous lands, they want to take them now for windmills, not just for, and again, that brings up the question of equity.
Liz.
Thank you for making Judy's comments clearer. It did have the effect of making Chase's less clear, and Chase is the other person that I think has been speaking that I can't quite hear. Just wanted to let you know. I don't want to duplicate things that have probably been said in the room, but I do urge all of us, I'm trying to find it right now, to review again the information that we received from the plants with regard to the actual usage and what would be used instead, because I've heard the comments, I think, in the room about physical deliveries versus environmental attributes, both, of course, having to occur within the region of New England where we exist in our electric market, But I believe the information we had from McNeil showed that the usage of the plant, I'm talking in terms of hours of the day and season, were at times when the otherwise available energy on the system would be the fossil. Yeah, and of course that gets into the whole, how does that compare? And that's why having a study makes all sorts of sense. But that, I believe, is what we had. So when I saw the phase up of clean renewable energy replacement type language here and elsewhere, I took it to mean that actually would replicate or, substitute for, and over time technology may change, and that could include storage paired with something that doesn't otherwise run at those hours. But at this time, that's not the case. So anyway, that was why, for me, just to get back to the language for a second, I would be looking to see something more like the Vermont Climate Council should commission a study by an independent third party that would be managed by the Climate Action Office to plan for, and then, the rest of the language, phase out and phase up. But it's hard for me to see how going further or more definitively than that for me would allow for me to participate in the consensus on this paragraph. So if
Liz,
that's where folks go, we can just have me clearly not included. That's fine.
Liz, I want you to actually, I think you just suggested some language. So either maybe in a comment box to the side, Jane. Yeah, go ahead, give it a shot. Liz, I want to try out your language. So let's give this a minute here.
Isn't the language you just suggested basically what we had before? It's just deleting what was.
She's replacing too.
Yeah, let's do it in a comment. Let's do it in a comment.
It might, well, in fairness, it might be closer to the original language, because I recall when I saw the initial draft that the subgroup came up with, it was, it was essentially fine. So at any rate, I wasn't trying to actually write on the fly. I was just letting you know where I am.
No, but I want to just try this now. I think what you're saying is Vermont Climate Council should commission a study immediately for the phase out of biomass electricity generation and phase in renewable energy X. And so it's essentially saying it's doing a study to specifically look at the phasing in and out. And then of course there's the detailed language we would have to work on further, I think, as people ask for. So there are some suggestions to that. So again, it would be definitive that it's really the study will look at phasing it out and then phasing in other things and then a bunch of other detail. It would, and I don't know whether that is kind of language that is enough. People feel like it's strong enough about it. Yeah, it's phasing out, just a matter of how we think about it, or whether that's not sufficient for other people. Jason, go ahead.
I didn't raise my hand. Okay. I have thoughts. I'm happy to hear what other people first.
Because I think what I want to do is I'm aware of we have some specific suggestions that I can summarize. I don't know how much more time we should spend on this paragraph right now, but just trying to get to the other recommendations as well, just to see where we are. So I think to write this further may take, again, a few people taking a crack at it.
What were you saying, Colin?
So I think Liz's language was, instead of to consider, I think it was to plan for.
Yeah. Thank you. Comments on looking at that box or other thoughts?
I don't oppose this language. However, there is power in a declarative statement indicating that action should be taken that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so this change, again, is not something that I would oppose, but it loses the power of saying we should take an action and we should commission a study to figure out how to do it. And instead it says we should commission a study. And studies are incredibly important, and oftentimes too, they then lead to inaction. And so to avoid a scenario in which a study then sort of dropped and then that was the end of the story, there is power in adding some additional words indicating that there is a direction that we should move in.
Could you tag something to the end of it? Like, so, I mean, I'm bad with run-on sentences, but in the interest of it, like, could you, because there's two things here that I think could be added to this, which might make it clearer, like a declaration at the end of that, you know, towards the consensus that this needs to happen, and then subject to the following considerations. And that's where we get into the paragraph below.
Subject to the following consideration. What do you mean
Well,
by
so
that?
like, so we're saying that like, we want to have the study, and then we outline below here some of the things that we want to talk about as far as equity, the communities that are impacted, market transitions.
So like where it says the study should include.
Yeah.
Like, so keep that language. Is that what you mean? And then just add some more clarity, some more specificity below that?
Yeah, and then as we talked about earlier, kind of add specificity below that. And I'm thinking about keeping all of this as one recommendation instead of splitting it, I guess, is overarching. So that would be the lead in to the broader paragraph.
Joe, are you suggesting any changes to the thing that Jane has in the box
No,
right
it
now?
would be a lead into this, starting with the study should before that.
Jason, do you have an idea?
I do have an idea. I'm wondering if it's the words advocate for that might be hanging people up. And so if those were to be changed to say something like Vermont Climate Council should plan for a phase out of wood biomass, electricity generation, et cetera, to inform the phase out, there should be this study. Would that change it? Like, we are keeping the sentiment that we need to plan for this. That is the objective. And we're saying to help us do that, we will have a study.
Why don't we try that? I think we'd end it after, we'd end a period there, and we'd start the next thing, the language that was suggested would change put in the box to decide, I think, right? So we'd have a definitive declarative statement at the front, to plan for the phase out.
And phase out of clean renewable energy replacement.
Yeah.
Okay.
Leave that, okay, and then we'd add Liz's, okay.
Well, I don't think we need
Oh, we don't
this
need to-
sentence at all
Okay.
anymore. We would then just go, it's just a matter of changing advocate.
So curious if folks could live with that. Again, I think we have, I want to know a few things. We may need more detail on forestry. Charlie, you requested, we need to say something more explicitly about load replacement. And we're going to strike the word, we suggesting rural, about working economies, or working economy. But I'm wondering if again, what do people think about that? At least the lead sentence there.
I can live with that. I would just point out the last sentence says for load replacement, but earlier in the sentence it says clean energy replacements. It's kind of redundant. We already have load replacement.
Okay.
Did we add the word immediately?
Yes, we should have that in there. Good question.
Yeah,
it's there.
Yes. Right there.
Okay.
Richard.
I'm fine.
Peggy.
Yeah, just wondering, I mean, maybe this is implied in the managed within the climate action office. Does that mean obviously we'll closely coordinate with like public service?
Yeah, I was gonna ask the same thing, just we're
have-
getting pinged right now, and since TJ is listening in and the director of planning for PSD, I wonder if this shouldn't be the climate action office, if it should be the public service department.
perhaps jointly informed by.
I mean, the climate action office implies to me that we will coordinate very closely with the public service department.
We just want to acknowledge that there's
Bit more
definitely
expertise.
expertise that lies with public service that will be critical.
TJ, do you want to comment on that?
Sorry, on the potential for the Department of Public Service to,
The study, exactly. Can we say the climate action office, or should we say the climate action office in coordination with the public utilities, or should we say something different from your perspective, given your role?
yeah, I think this language that's being added right now is fine. In terms of a study that is done, I guess I'll withhold comment on the whole other piece of this.
Thank you for doing so for the moment. Jane, do you have another?
I guess someone else has just pinged via, since there's no chat, and said, like, the Vermont Climate Council planning for a phase out is actually not like what the Vermont Climate Council is actually capable of
So
doing.
should we say Vermont should plan for the phase out? I mean, it's
Yeah.
a little, I know it's a little vague, and then we say that the Climate Council then should essentially immediately.
They're doing the study.
Right.
What about suggest?
Uh-huh.
Right, I mean, the climate council can certainly recommend via an
Recommend a
updated
plan.
plan, but they don't have the power to directly.
All right, Jan, we'll give you a second to play with this, and then
The Vermont Climate Council should recommend that the state plan for,
should recommend that the state plan for. And then
Should it just say, can we get rid of should? Vermont Climate Council recommends.
Yeah. Well, I guess we're telling the Vermont Climate Council what to do, so I think the should has to stay in it, because it's sort of task to the Climate Council, right?
But these are the recommendations that they would.
Sorry.
Yeah. But these are just the recommendations that they will act on.
Yeah.
So there's.
You choose.
I'm gonna get rid of it.
I will, I promise I'll call the public and keep the group focused here too. If you want to write me a note, I will. Yeah, absolutely. Give it to Judy and she can share exactly. Okay, Liz, I'm curious with this language, what your viewpoint of it is.
Besides being clunky. Which it feels like.
What was that? Sorry, I didn't hear the last comment.
Clunky, don't worry about the clunkiness, just the content.
Oh, yeah, right. Don't make it elegant yet. Let's see. What did we do with the if? Because I just have this fundamental problem of recommending a scientific study with a conclusion already. I mean, it's one thing to plan for and recommend the planning for, and to even expect that sort of outcome after review. But yeah, I liked the original language that you all came up with, because it felt much more even-handed to me. So
I think there's a number of people who are, I've already moved past the threshold of the if, Liz, to the when and how. I realize you may not be there yet in terms of that question of if.
So do we just put it back in?
I put it back in because Liz was talking, but I
Yeah.
can take it back out.
Liz,
Quickly.
Liz, Jane, just hold that or put a yellow on it or something, just the if, only the if. I think the when and how would be great. All right, so I'm hearing from Liz, want to leave the if in. I've heard from others, I think they want the if out. So there we are in terms of the difference. Again, I know you all are working hard towards consensus. This is the easy way out, but one of the ways to reflect the consensus, but where there's difference, is to acknowledge what there's difference and say we agree with the study, we agree with the planning for it. What we don't agree with is whether we've already passed the threshold of the question or not, and we did not come to consensus, and we can acknowledge that, right? On the gift.
Wait, could you explain that? We
Yeah.
have not come to consensus?
Liz is saying she wants if, yeah, and I've heard other people say want if out.
Right, but have we come to consensus because it's after Liz? Because Liz said.
I can't hear Judy, sorry.
Yeah, Judy, let's keep this one. Can we get? Oh, sorry. The phone all up my.
Liz, at one point, did you say that you would go into agreement with the rest of the group? Didn't you just say that?
What did you say, Judy? I'm sorry. I'm really having a hard time hearing your sentence. I apologize.
If the rest of the group says if should be out, didn't you say at one point that you would agree with what the rest of the group was, so that we can?
I think what I said was, I think what I said was I'd be willing to stand aside and have that noted and just move on, which is a little different.
Okay.
More what
so
I think,
that's-
more what Patrick said a second ago.
Liz, we would note then essentially in a footnote or something that, and we can be specific or general, like one member of the group stood
Yeah.
aside for it or does not agree with it yet? Or does not agree
Yeah,
with
and
it
it's
yet?
just, it gets back to the stuff we talked about earlier in terms of actual replacement and having an independent third party do it. And, you know, we did see some evidence from the plants, as I mentioned earlier. So yeah, no, I feel like that's the way to go for me at least. And I also wondered, we're going to present it to the subcommittees and they'll see it one way or the other. I know there's also a couple task members probably. Are we all here today? We got Billy, I guess, absent, right?
Yeah, both gone today.
Yeah. So right, there might be some further discussion and tweaks for those reasons too.
Shirley, I want to just check back with you too, did we, you suggested, and maybe Chase had too, that we maybe need to work on the language below to be more detailed. And I'm curious if we've got the first sentence roughly like it is, noticing Liz's exception, whether the language as is okay, or you want more work to be done on the language below.
I'm sorry, what was your question?
Yeah, there's a lot of language in there. Chase, you had originally proposed being more detailed in that language.
Yeah.
So the question is, do we still need to do that?
The question about the language below that first statement.
Yes, in other words, I think.
Yeah, no, I think there's some more work we can do to the rest of that paragraph, certainly to, yeah.
So how would we accomplish that? Because I think we're probably out of time to do that here as a full group, given we have other 5 seconds to go through. Is there a way that we could detail this language in a way that lives with kind of the group's general but not full consensus?
Just a suggestion, what if it said something to the effect of, and the alternative revenue streams and actions that could be taken by public and private actors to realize those streams, or something like that. The idea being that there would have to be some sort of a private investment, and that could be facilitated by, public support. Something like that, yeah, we're adding to the clump.
Yeah.
How does that straight and Shirley? Is that sort of?
Yeah, I like the principle of it. I mean, personally, I would like to see something very specific in there. This is just might be personally, would like to see something specific in there around the question of wood flows and market impacts.
So that would be the.
Sorry, I wonder, because right now we're talking a lot about, more broadly about electricity generation and where that's going to come from and the impacts, but we haven't really talked about maybe the ramifications specifically on like forest and like forest conservation in Vermont. And that to me is like what you're trying to get at with these specifics, but maybe be more explicit about the impacts, just percent forested landscape in Vermont. And the tools needed to ensure that stays.
Yeah, and I'm not good at coming up with language and editing it in real time, but I would be happy to take a stab at a sentence that might address the points that I'd like to see in there.
Just note that for me, it's less about retooling the plants in their current physical locations, but just knowing that there's replacement markets for that low grade wood, which are vital for carrying out the management.
It seems like that's the crux of the issue, right?
But I mean, I'm not looking for like McNeil to be retooled with a facility in its current location.
Yeah,
having the same impact on the communities.
Right, exactly.
It can be wherever, as long as it's a viable market.
Yeah, and that's basically the crux of where I want to make sure this comes down clear on is those areas.
So Charlie, I think let's do this. I want to just be careful with words like low grade and stuff, because I think they have historic resonance we want to avoid. That being said, I wonder, Charlie, if you could work on a sentence or two and we could bring that back to the group next.
Yeah, I would be happy to, because I think the stronger that language can be around, sustaining a strong, again, words are words, but like working lands economy, just if we use as a state, I think the more that can be in there, the more comfortable I am with some of the other language around phasing out transitions.
And we'll also need to know right now, at least Jane, I think what we do is again, Liz is, I think, agreed to acknowledge that she does not agree with going to let this move forward. So we need to figure out the language for that. So we would need to kind of add that language in somewhere in a footnote or a parenthetical or someplace. So I think just to note that too, is it's a bit more homework we'll have to do on that as well. All right, with that, what I'm going to suggest now is because before we go to another, Richard,
Before we leave this, I just want to say something from putting on my epidemiologist hat for a minute. Doing environmental health studies is really hard to do them well. It's really, really hard. And I'll just mention some of the reasons why they're hard. One is that the people most affected by environmental hazards, like say the McNeil plant, and also the same people also have lots of other adverse exposure. And so that makes pulling apart the contribution of one particular plant difficult, pulling that out from other exposures. The second issue is that small population size. So if you have a few hundred people that are heavily exposed, that doesn't actually give you very much power for most health outcomes. It doesn't give you very much statistical power. So then you say, well, then let's draw the circle bigger so we have more people in our study area. But then you dilute the effect. You're adding a bunch of people who have lower exposure by drawing the circle bigger. And so it gets harder to detect an effect. So I'm just, those are just some basic issues in terms of epi-studies. What you can do effectively with a small population is do careful studies of exposure and where they have known health impacts. But if your focus is on showing that people already have adverse health effects, it just can be really difficult to do well. And I just throw that out as a caution. If and when you all engage Vermont Department of Health in conversation about this, these are some of the things that are going to come up when they talk to you. I pretty much guarantee that.
Is a full epidemiological study embedded in that scope of work?
No, it isn't, but it's been embedded in our conversation. I've heard it in our conversation. That's why I bring it up.
So Richard, for this, just to close out this paragraph, not that that's not an important point, is there anything you want to add to this paragraph before we try to close?
No, because we talk about health, climate, and financial costs and benefits. That's pretty broad. And I don't think we should specify any more carefully, any more detail without involving the relevant agency.
I have a question, Richard. Is there an assumption in that word that in what's written here that the Department of Health would be included in this? Because we know the medical center has done research, we know the EPA has done research.
Yeah.
Is that something that automatically happens, the Department of Health would be included?
Well, it doesn't automatically happen. Some manager of the Department of Health would have to say, yes, this is important. I'm going to allocate resources to doing this, including reviewing what other people have done previously, as you mentioned.
Chase, yes, I want to be, my goal is here, just to be clear, group, I want to see if we can close on this paragraph. So each time we raise a new issue, we have our time closing out. The features aren't important.
I wasn't trying to get you to change this. This is cautionary comment for everybody.
But then I get the very, it's also absolutely accurate around technologies.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so I think that kind of just side note point about Richard's concern and the point about epidemiological studies and kind of the challenges. I think what we want to do is we've got to work some language around Liz's exception, Charlie's detailing, cleaning this up. And then what we'd like to do is, I think at this point, before I go to number 4, I'd like to actually take public comment now, and we'll start on the issue. Jane.
Just one comment that was raised via Microsoft Teams chat, that based on your comment, Richard, is that this may point to the fact that it's not a single study that we're trying to do, that it's many studies. And so I just wonder if there's some, like, just study or studies.
Because evidence-based study, or in parentheses, IPS, right, studies. That would acknowledge that you might need different expertise for different parts of the concern there for different studies.
Do you mind if I give you a comment now?
Yeah, no, it's.
I do think that there's value in doing a full epidemiological study, and I also think that there is, in some ways, no real reason to do so at the same time, just because we know that burning wood produces toxic particulate matter. We know that people live adjacent, that they are breathing it. We know there is no safe level of toxic particulate matter. And so I agree that we could go whole hog on a study, and at the same time, we could, I think, feel reasonably sure that it would be better not to have the public, especially, communities historically and disproportionate bird breathing. So I think that is a nuance.
So here's, I'm gonna suggest this. Let's
Embedded
hold
in my comments was a recommendation for an exposure study.
So let me do this. 6 and 7 are actually very, very relevant to this topic. Very much. 6 and 7, so what I'd like to do is pause for public comment on 3. And then I want to jump to 6 and 7 next because of where the conversation's going. And then we'll come back to 4 and 5. So I think that what Richard just said is very, very well relevant and shade relevant to 6 and 7. So if we could pause for a second. I want to see if first see if there's public comment in the room. And then Jane, could you pull up the full Zoom screen to see if there's anything? And if you want to make a public comment on screen, please raise your hand, but let me go in the room first. And if the person making public comment in the room could stand close to the table.
We can just pass the phone too.
Yeah, so, and what I am trying to do is you can touch the phone if you want, but the phone's also a transmission for colds and other things, so. If you want to touch it, have at it, but you don't have to. Okay, Cheryl, join you.
Okay, thank you. So there are a few things, and we moved past them. One suggestion is to remove the words plan for, because it's just like a little bit more to put things off, plan for, but it says this exact same thing. If you just recommend that there's a phase out, rather than recommending a plan to phase out, let's just recommend the phase out. Additionally, let's see, a long time ago, I think, Richard, you brought up the fact that the main problem is that burning wood is bad for climate. Well, but we have to keep equity in mind, and so health got brought into the issue, into the reasoning. But the other thing is that there are environmental issues too, biodiversity and clean water, et cetera. So if you're going to talk about climate, you need to talk about biodiversity and water and environmental issues as well as health issues. The study issue of getting the study or studies done, it should be immediate, yes, but I think it's important to say that it should be completed quickly. And I really think an aspirational idea about timing of things is important. We've got dates here, 2025, 2030, and 2050, right? So maybe we could use those dates as the time frame to phase out. Planning for just doesn't really work when that comes up. A while ago, Rygate was planning to shut down, and there was I can't remember the name of it, but there was a Zoom meeting where everybody went, where many people went and talk about what would be done if it were to shut down. And I think this was going along in the vein of just transitions, but really what happened at that meeting was, and I don't know, some of you might have been at that. I think Jared was at it, but he's not here now. Mainly it just was everybody coming to talk about let's not close the plant, rather than actually doing what the goal of the meeting was to talk about how to move forward when it closes. So planning for is, I think that's pushes things off. Let's see what else. Oh, right. When you were talking about where the energy would come from in-state instead of McNeil or Rygate and various places, and possibly instead of Hydro-Quebec. Do you know there's I don't know how many acres it is, but 200 megawatts, I think, of solar energy being generated in Ludlow and Cavendish down south. And all that energy is huge, mountaintop solar. All that energy is being sent, I think, either to Connecticut or Massachusetts. Well, I mean, we could keep it here instead, you know, that's one idea. So
Did you say mountaintop solar?
it's not called that. It is on the top of a mountain in Ludlow and Cavendish. It's like it was a farm.
Sure, Joy, any
and-
other comments?
No.
I'm just gonna, I'm sorry.
Yep.
I'll probably picture the same different. Do we,
No,
anybody,
no.
Jane, can you see on Zoom if there's any public comment, anybody else?
There's something, Steve Crowley.
Oh, so wait, there's someone else in here too. Sorry, let me get someone else in here. Who's else gonna comment? Yeah, come on, if you could just stand close to the mic. Maybe you're in show business, which just state name and affiliation.
Yeah,
Great, thank you.
Infinite, Co-Pleasure, just live resident in the neighborhood. And I guess I'm looking for some guidance on a point that you made, Jamie,
Yeah, Jamie.
on the timeline for electric. It was, you know, it was in terms of the market share for electric. And so I'm just curious about how we come to determine the timeline for market share, because that sounds like some of the tension that you were bringing up, Charlie, right? Like wanting to know, having some certainty around, you know, where to go when we're unable to, you know, rely on this old system. So I'm just in terms of process, you know, and coming to terms with, you know, understanding where the market share is going to be. How do we do that? How do we get to come to determine, again, a timeline for the market share for electric, right? That's all.
And what I want to do is let me get through public comment and then I'll come back to a few things that people said just to capture. So I've held that. We'll come back and we'll get all the public comment from the weekend. Anybody else in the room? All right, Steve, over to you.
Hi, thanks. So Steve Crowley with the Vermont Sierra Club. Our Sierra Club chapter has a long history with the McNeil plant in Burlington. When it was first proposed, we opposed that plant, and you know, in the permitting process and eventually in litigation. And there was a settlement that was arrived at that about limiting the size, and that was probably 40 years ago. And 20 years ago, when McNeil, when Burlington Electric wanted to increase its output, they had to wrap us in with the discussions about how that was going to be handled. And there was it was specifically a question about, you know, nitrogen oxides pollution, but the crucial issue at the time really was about odor and dust and local impacts right in the neighborhood. The result of that, to make a long story short, was that in that settlement 20 years ago or so, a fund was set up to bring the neighbors into the discussion. And it was really difficult at the time for BED and engineers and the neighbors all to have a discussion where they weren't talking past each other. And this fund was set up to enable them to hire engineers to support them and an attorney. And as I understand it, that fund was not entirely used up, and it still sits there. So I want to bring that to the attention of people, that there may be this fund still sitting there to support the engagement of the neighbors, specifically, you know, just up the hill from McNeil in that discussion. Now, so that's one point I'd like to make. Another crucial point, I think, about the electricity, you know, biomass electricity in Vermont, is that we're also talking about using biomass for things like advanced wood heat and heating schools, and there's a lot of emphasis we have on that. And as you all know, that's a much more efficient way of using wood energy. And multiple, like 90 or something percent efficient as opposed to 20 or 30% efficient. So we wonder, one of our biggest concerns about that whole picture of using woody biomass for energy in whatever form is the impact on Vermont's ecosystems and other regional ecosystems. And ultimately, if we're going to ramp up the high efficient use of woody biomass, we're going to be up against that limit. And to us, it just doesn't make sense to try to continue this really poor use of woody biomass for electricity when there's a much better use for it. And it's a resource that has to be seen as a limited resource. It's just a question of, I don't know if we have a clear picture, we should, but I don't think we do have a clear picture of what the limit is on that resource. But unless we have that picture, I don't think that it's responsible to continue down both paths at the same time, using biomass electricity and pushing advanced wood heat. I think it really is important to figure out what that overall cap should be. And one other quick comment, this is getting ahead a little bit in later in your agenda, but I know a discussion of the other document that I think may be an introduction to this, and it references greenhouse gas accounting. And in fact, there's a footnote, but the footnote, if you look at it, doesn't really go to anything. It would be really helpful if it did. It goes to a 2017 or 2019 document that talks about it, a 1995 document. And when it comes to that, if we are basing our greenhouse gas accounting for woody biomass on a protocol that's almost 30 years old, we know that so much has been learned since that time about accounting, especially for biomass. So I think, to me, it seems incumbent on Vermont to do an upgrade of that accounting system rather than rely on something that's 30 years old. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, any other public comment? I want to summarize quickly, and then I want to jump to 6 and 7. So I would note for the comments just made, the comment around thermal is actually recommendation 4B, which we'll come back to. I think that Cheryl Joy, I think the word plan was a carefully wrought consensus of this group, so I'm not going to try to relitigate that with the group unless they want to, but I would say that Cheryl Joy did suggest we might say something like advance immediately and complete expeditiously would be language to actually make it more clear. So I wonder if we might want to think about adding that to the text. In terms of the question of market share and electricity, Jane, I don't know if you wanted to try to answer the question Infinite raised or not at this time, or maybe that's a side conversation. I don't know.
Sure if that was Liz who's speaking to that. While I'd like to think I could talk very eloquently about market share of electricity, I guarantee Liz could.
Right. And Liz, you're still there?
I am. I took a note. I don't think there's a quick response. So I'd be happy, Infinite, if Infinite's in the room, to follow up. And I'm sure there's others in the room who have some information for him too. If I can't tell if he's in the room.
Email or something we can share with. Okay, if you actually give that to Jane, she can make sure you're connected to Liz.
Yeah, or Jane can feel free to share my contact. Feel free, Jane, to give Infinite my contact. I'm right here in Burlington, so it'd be easy.
Okay, great, thank you so much. And then I think in regard to the question of, I think there was also some issues raised around an existing fund, which I want to actually have Judy speak to in just a second when we talk about 6 and 7. So I think one question, Jane, could you just add a note that we potentially could add up on this thing as it says is multi-meeting here. I know. So we go back up a little bit higher. Word immediately. Yeah, would be okay. Where's the study part? Right in front of a phase out study to and I think the idea would be to say advance, immediately or commission immediately and complete expeditiously or something like that. We need a complete part to that.
Well, I think we should plan taking the plan out.
Yeah, I think that's what, and then again, I think the group is, I think my sense of the group is that plan was a carefully wrought balance of that language. So unless you want to revisit it, I wouldn't suggest revisit it because we'll be back to it.
So I like the
because we've got a consensus but for one on that language we already had. So I'm always cautious about reopening if we've kind of reached a careful balance. We can look at this again when it's all completed too. All right. Okay, I want to go to 6 and 7.
Can we just to that addition? I mean, I feel like immediately captures that. I mean,
I think the idea is the commission went immediately and completed expeditiously. I think it's just don't drag it out for years. That's the point, right?
Yeah, I think we already. I mean,
No, we didn't.
well, I mean, I think study immediately.
Right. I think I would say an advance an evidence-based study immediately to be completed expeditiously. I think it's the complete part that's maybe missing. And again, if you guys don't agree with the language, so be it. That was just a suggestion given the
Yeah, sure.
Okay, let's go to 6 and 7 if we could. Okay, yeah, 6 and 7. Okay, so I think this gets to the conversation we were starting to have just before public comment about public health. So there's 3 things in here. I realize 6 is mixed up with actually 2. So 6 addresses the engagement question, and the second I want to ask you to talk about that fund that was mentioned by the public commenter. There's also a sentence in the middle of that that's actually somewhat a separate issue, which is adverse impacts to public health, cultural resources, and quality of life should be assessed and quantified, which is actually a separate point from engagement. And then 7 is really about monitoring. So I think we've got 3 ideas we need to work on here with 6 and 7. But Judy, maybe first that fund, let me just speak to that.
Well, I can't speak to money, because I never saw any of that, but I can speak to what happened. Did you hear that, Liz? Yeah, but I can speak to what happened 20 years ago, because I was a part of that. And Steve was actually correct. You could drive anywhere in this neighborhood and with an hour of parking your car, write your name in the dust that was coming from the download of the chips from the trains to McNeil. It was horrific. People were suffering terribly with ailments. And they actually made these, like, I don't know what you call them, like Quonset hut buildings. And so when the train pulls in, the dust flies to the top of the Quonset huts and drops down. So the dust is less. It certainly is less. But as we know, by looking at the particulate matter numbers we've been given, it's still flying all over. And I'm not sure that we got an answer as to where the monitors actually are, but I don't believe the monitors are where the people are. And I know that was discussed way back when as well. And so we need to perhaps relive some of what happened 20 years ago and take that into consideration for today, because the same thing is occurring. Yeah, Steve's got his thumb up. The same thing is occurring at not the greatest level, because it's not as visible as it was 20 years ago, but it's still present. It's still causing health issues. Number 7? For McNeil, yeah, but what about Rygate? Because on the other side of Rygate, it's forest, but when you look on Google Earth, but who knows who's living in those forests?
We could certainly add, for under 7, we could actually put McNeil and Rygate. Okay, so I want to just, Richard, back to your earlier comment. I want to just add that question on number 6. Seems like 6 has 2 ideas. It's an engagement idea and an adverse impacts assessment idea. So I wonder if we should separate those out and have the paragraph on engagement, 6A, 6B on assess impacts, and then a sentence, Richard, to your point, adding specifically what on the public health side would maybe be most expeditious. So
my first reaction would say, yes, of course, separate them, but really, in order to do the assessment of adverse impacts properly, you need community engagement. So I don't see those as being all that separate.
Great.
Can I ask a question? smokestack emissions are not the same as all these 18-wheelers and all these trains that are coming day after day after day after day. Shouldn't we be discussing and studying the impacts of the exhaust? I mean, this is a pretty, Inside Avenue is a pretty main road for 18-wheelers coming from McNeil, and the train runs parallel 5 days a week, 25 to 37 cars a day.
You could just drop the word
give it a little
smokestack, just say emissions.
And then it's, and then emissions would be generally, new source of labor, trucks, smokestack.
Or should it list both, smokestack and?
You could say emissions such as smokestacks.
Usually, we call those ambient emissions, so it takes into account anything that's happening in the ambient air. So that is helpful.
It would say
It's a smokestack.
Yeah, that might be
You could
best.
say ambient, and it would be measuring the air quality of the ambient air.
Because the transportation has definitely increased in 20 years coming here.
Other thoughts about 6 or 7 in terms of additions or corrections people would want to see? Liz, go ahead, sorry.
Oh, yeah, okay, great. Yeah, I had 2 comments. One was maybe something Richard raised earlier a little bit. I had expected to see, and I think it should be in here explicitly, probably they kind of go together, 6 and 7, but the Department of Health in the lead, given that we're talking about public health exposure assessments and even thinking about it in terms of social vulnerability, which is also something the Department of Health leads. So I see that it's JT and this group. I wondered about this group having a continuing, I think I raised this earlier in one of our earlier sessions. I'm not sure that our task group has a continuing role on that. So I'm not sure we should put ourselves in, as it were, in the draft. And I would want to see the Department of Health, leading an effort here. And then the only other question I had was actually what you were talking about a second ago. When I was just reading it, I was wondering, just given residents change, et cetera, whether it just shouldn't be other neighborhoods adjacent to the plants or whatever. In other words, the way the first sentence is written, some might read as, depends on the individual resident and when they've been there, et cetera. Whereas if you just had neighborhood, that would not be the case. So I'll stop there.
On that first one, the second point you said, engagement must occur with the neighborhoods of, is that the better way to say it? And strike the word resident, is that your point? Something to that effect?
No, actually it was the whose residents. Like when I was reading it, I was like, whose residents have been exposed to emissions and other exposures? Well, I would imagine it depends upon lots of things from an epidemiology point of view. I mean, dose equals exposure times, amount times time and all that. Other people know more than I do there. But so I would have just left it at neighborhoods adjacent to or something like that. But
okay, we get who's resident. Okay, so
adjacent to the emissions and other adverse exposures related to the plants or something like that. And anyway.
Jane, you want to give that a crack?
Adjacent to, is this what we're talking about?
To the plants who have been exposed to, I think, right?
I don't know if that would work because Chase had a question about the new one, right? And
what?
I said, I don't know if adjacent will work because you had a question about the new north end at one time. And that's certainly not adjacent to.
My question with adjacent is, the ambient air pollutants float with the wind. And so,
Got it. Yeah, no, that's fine with me. However, I was just more focused on the opposite issue of, like, even before putting the word adjacent, it felt limiting in respect to what you all are talking about. And it feels like it's more geographic than person oriented for that sentence.
I think if we get rid of the words adjacent to the plants, to see other neighborhoods who have been exposed, maybe we get rid of, and just get rid of to the plants too, I think, Jane, just until we say other residents. I'm not sure this fall gets it, but trying.
Or maybe just go all the way to exposed, neighborhoods exposed.
There we go, okay. And that leaves open the question of which neighborhoods too. Okay, Judy.
If people are talking about like the Department of Health and places looking like that, looking at this, cultural resources looks like it's just hanging there. Because what is the public health gonna do about cultural resources?
Yeah.
It looks like it should be someplace else, another sentence, whatever.
I wonder if we could say adverse impacts to public, and the quality of life might get at the social vulnerability, but once it could be adverse impacts to public health and quality of life should be assessed and quantified with the support of the Department of Health, or whatever the right words are. Then we probably need something separately about cultural resources and who would take that lead. And then we need to say something about the Just Transition Subcommittee and or this group, given those.
I mean, is this about engagement or is this about a study?
It's both, I think.
Because
Richard's
that's
point.
what's confusing, because the Just Transition surely should lead on engagement. But then this sentence in the middle is sort of going back to the study that we've already been talking about in number 3.
What if we, let's try this for next. Let's move that last sentence.
Well, I don't know, perhaps just after the word and quantify pursuant to the study discussed in paragraph 4 or something like that. And just note that third party will be cooperation with the relevant agencies, departments would be studying these impacts. And that can inform this effort. But I agree with you, James. There's a study and an engagement, the two form one another.
And I think what Jay said added number 3 in conjunction with appropriate agencies or whatever the right words are. Something to that effect is to add that. So then I wonder if we do this. And at least that addresses Judy's question part, because different agencies will be responsible for different things. And then I wonder if we move that sentence to the end of that paragraph, just because we want to talk specifically, Jane, to your point about the role of Just Transition to the engagement itself. So put that at the end, because Richard wisely pointed out they're tied together. And then I guess the question was, right, we don't know the future of this group, should we just leave it for now? The Just Transition Subcommittee should lead. And we'll be signing on this group for now, because it's going to depend on what the Climate Council recommends for this or another group moving forward. I don't know, how does that look, number 6 now?
You could say in partnership with relevant task groups, because in addition to the Climate Council, because in addition to Just Transitions, there is a public engagement task group actually of the Climate Council. That's really where the conversation's been living, not the subcommittee. It gets like reported out to the subcommittee.
So maybe we should put that in partnership with the appropriate task groups or the DCC task groups. All right, how does number 6 look now with the changes James has captured? Liz, go ahead. Liz, did you have a comment?
Oh, sorry, I can take the hand down, it's fine.
Oh, okay.
I'm trying to read it, sorry, apologize.
Yeah, Colin engaged in this conversation. I would have thought that the Science and Data Subcommittee would have an interest in this project.
I think that's very true.
He's the chair of that.
Why is he asked?
Yeah, I think there would definitely be interest in that subcommittee review as well.
We added subcommittees in there. Any other suggested changes to the language in 6? Anybody who can't live with 6 as edited? Okay, then I'm gonna move on to number 7. Jane, we put that on one page, yeah. Okay. So any comments on number 7?
I just want to say, I think that better monitoring is a more productive approach from a health point of view than epidemiologic studies are, said the epidemiologist.
Why so?
Because you can do them right away, they're unambiguous.
Yeah.
Doing epi studies, I don't know how big the population is. I don't know I don't know exactly what the health outcomes would be of interest. I don't know how mobile the population is. I mean, it's an uncertain activity.
I think you just said very well what I tried to say earlier.
Okay.
Isn't it cheaper too?
Sorry?
Isn't it cheaper too?
Well, it's quicker for sure.
Yeah. I don't think the monitors are that expensive.
Any other comments to 7?
Yeah, I guess I agree with Richard, and I'd ask that maybe we add a little detail here about, I guess this type of emissions monitoring, I think it's probably solidly within the wheelhouse of the DC Air Quality and Climate Division in terms of the monitoring that we perform related to our air contaminant sources. And so we have a hazardous air contaminant monitoring evaluation procedure, and then I mean, we use this data to inform whether or not the permits that we've issued are operating as we intend them to be. So I guess I just want to point out that this will have implications for that program, but also that program should be involved in the design of any monitoring, because we work with our monitoring section within the Air Division to design monitoring studies that can inform our other work in a constructive way. And so I just think that it's important to channel the expertise of that division of state government, so that the way that we're setting up the evaluation and the study is actually helpful and meaningful. And I certainly don't want to say that division currently has resources and capacity to participate in this study, but I think it's great that we've highlighted the IRA funding. It provides a lot of opportunity for different types of air monitoring, so hopefully that can be something that we can harness in doing this, but just wanted to flag that
How does that
it should be designed in conjunction with those experts.
How does that?
That's fine. I would just comment that this is a much simpler problem than, say, a comparably sized chemical plant that is emitting a complex soup of 100 different chemicals that have, many of which have unknown health effects. This is a much simpler problem. And we know what PM 2.5 does and how it works.
Yeah, and I just want to build off of that and say that, you know, the way that we're currently regulating these facilities and the permits that they have all reflect the fact that we regard them to be in compliance with the criteria limits, which includes PM, which is, you know, therefore in compliance with the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, which are the sole purpose of those standards to be protective of public health. And then we also have a hazardous air contaminant program in the state of Vermont that we use to determine whether or not a facility is emitting hazardous air contaminants beyond an action level. And the way that we set that action level in conjunction with the Department of Health is measuring against a very conservative standard that makes assumptions about exposure in the community and sensitive populations. In fact, our hazardous air contaminant program is one of the most protective of public health in the country, and we're often criticized as being overly stringent compared to other states. So I just want to point that out, that, you know, the permit that we issued kind of embodies all of those assumptions, that we are being protective of public health because we are within those action levels and within those ambient air standards that by design are meant to be protective of public health. So I just want to start from that assumption and just offer that any information that we collect via this monitoring will help to better inform the, you know, effectiveness of that permit.
I don't argue with that at all. it has been asserted that the placement of the current monitoring stations is not really optimal for assessing people's exposure. That's been asserted.
Sorry, which monitor you talking about, Richard? I just want to make sure.
PM 2.5 monitors in the vicinity of the McNeil and
Sure,
Highgate
so our
sites.
like state air monitoring stations,
yeah.
not the stack, not the continuous emissions monitoring that's in the plant. Okay.
But you could imagine, for example, recruiting a dozen or 20 people to wear personal air monitors as they go about their daily lives to determine what the actual levels are in people's breathing zones. The expectation would be that if the permits are doing what they're supposed to do, that the levels will be small, will be low if you do that. But you won't know until you do it.
That's right.
Jane, can you pull up the cursor so we don't see the correction? If you really take a look to see if that number 7 is acceptable to the group, and then we're going to go back to 4 and then to 5.
I have a question. So again, we're addressing public health monitoring with number 7, listing agencies. But then when you go back at 6 again, and you've got that cultural component in there, it wouldn't be any of those agencies. But I understand that 7 is only addressing public health. So how do we make that stand out?
But we haven't really, cultural resources is kind of lost.
Exactly, because I would assume it would be the Division of Historical Preservation that would address it, but we don't, it just hangs there like a bush path.
Would you feel comfortable with the decision?
Yes, maybe. Wait a minute. Okay, what?
Would you feel comfortable adding the Division of Historical Preservation? Would that be?
Well, it doesn't match with the public health monitoring. Do you see what I'm saying?
I do, yeah, I do. I think
And
I'm
so-
wondering if there's something we could add there.
Yeah, it could, I mean, it just seems like it dangles.
And I think maybe we should say for cultural, I'm not sure the right word, but for cultural resource impacts, cultural resource impact studies, that should be in conjunction with the agency that Chase or Judy just mentioned. So I don't know whether we put that at the end of 7 or is it
Do
separate.
you feel comfortable with that happening, Judy?
Yeah,
Yeah.
just so it doesn't get lost in the weeds.
Okay.
So
I
Jane,
mean, because public health is so important to everyone. I want that to stand out, but I don't want cultural resources to be lost.
I would argue that if that's the case, then we should consider separate. It feels very like public health.
Yeah.
why don't we just create a number 8?
Cultural
Why don't we create a number 8 to say for, for public, number 8 would be for cultural resource impact studies to be done in conjunction with.
Well, I mean, it is in number 3. That's, could we just, it feels like then we're having separate bullets on separate studies rather than trying to do it
Where is
comprehensively.
it in number 3?
Or we should add it if it's not, because that was certainly.
Maybe after the first traditional ecological knowledge.
Health, climate, could we just put cultural?
Well, because I'm not thinking of, for cultural resources, I'm not thinking about the land, I'm thinking about the archaeological site. The 1,700 acres here is placed on the most highly sensitive archaeological site in the state. And it's on the state historical register.
That's why I wondered about the Division of Historic Preservation actually, only because they might look at it very different with respect to the age of the buildings
Exactly.
and like they don't actually feel the right. They have criteria that they source and review for historic preservation, but
Yeah.
actually could make the buildings historic or change, not look at it comprehensively.
Well, and there's 24 archaeological reports at this point for this 1,700 acres.
Can we scroll down to, I think it was 6?
Yeah, it was 6. Yeah.
This is where,
Oh, here.
right? Right, so this is where Judy would make the change.
Probably.
So if the division of, what's it called, historical.
It's just historic.
If that's not necessarily the best entity to do this, given the focus that they have, that might look more at buildings, Judy, than on like artifacts that.
Well, they do, it's the same department.
Yeah,
They do.
UVM does all of their work, I think.
Who does?
UVM. they
John
like
Saul?
Yeah,
Yeah, no, Scott Dillon does.
he does the actual archaeology. I think they sub it all out, but
But there's a state SHPO, right? There's a state historic preservation officer.
yes,
So
that's the
essentially the
one
SHPO is the ultimate responsible party.
yes.
Do we want to mention that explicitly? It's like Liz has her hand up. Oh, Liz, go ahead.
I had something so minor. If you go down to 7, there's just a typo I want to catch. Second line of 7, right after and Reigate and cited should just be an S, not a C.
Good point. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And we could add so appropriate just such as, and you could say such as the state historic preservation officer. You could say that, if you want to, such as state historic preservation officer.
It just sort of doesn't get lost in the office.
The officer.
We have a SHPO, which is a state historic preservation office.
Okay, great. All right, good. All right, anything else on 6 and 7 before we go back to 4? All right. Okay, well, watching for Liz was just reaching you on mute. Okay, guys. All right, so 4, I'm gonna be bold here and just see how people think about 4A. 4B is a little different matter. 4A, we talk about the expansion for thermal cogeneration, and then we have a lot of detail, but it's kind of a vague investigation piece. So it's really for bullet point 1, really just maybe part of that phase out. We should mention the cogen as part of the study and just not try to do all that detail for the bullet here. Or do people want all that detail?
Sorry, can you rephrase for?
Yeah, I was gonna say
what you just said.
Yeah, it seems to me like we say it should be investigated very vaguely, and then we have kind of a lot of explanation. And I wonder if it would be just easier to mention as part of the phase out study, you look at the proposed, thermal expansion just as part of the overall things you're looking at.
And consider the archaeological site.
Yes, and include that too.
Because that's why it would be difficult to do.
And then you'd have to include that, that's right. I'm just trying to make things simpler as opposed to kind of have to sort through all this paragraph. If you want to keep it, then we should sort through it. I think it's a little odd, we phase it out and look at all these things and we talk completely separately and distinctly for the thermal expansion as if it were a separate activity, when in fact it would be part of, I think, thinking about some phase out.
Tension.
Liz.
Liz, go ahead, and then Adam. Liz, go ahead.
Sure, Patrick, I was having a little trouble hearing you, so if I'm off base, just let me know. But it's one of the reasons why the if and the other paragraph seemed important to me, because this paragraph, the piece of this paragraph that doesn't seem to be captured elsewhere is the life cycle analysis demonstrating GHG emissions from the expansion are less than otherwise would be avoided by thermal applications displaced on an adequate time scale. And again, assuming an appropriate scientific investigation, that makes sense to me. And that part isn't, I don't think, explicitly discussed in the portion above. And I think I had understood the original draft of this to be open to the idea that it would be appropriate for McNeil to potentially utilize thermal capabilities in order to displace other fossil fuels people would be using for heating instead of wood. And yeah, so in theory, that sentence is the important one that isn't included above. I agree the first part about public health investigation and all of that is covered by what we just said. So
that's very helpful.
I'll stop there, but I think it needs some tweaking to bring it all together.
And again, I think what maybe missing in this paragraph is the cultural and the potential expansion impacts on cultural resources, which I'm not sure is in there either. Adam, you were going to say?
Yeah, I'm not sure about how to solve it, but like my thinking is that there's a lot of different ways that the thermal component could be tacked onto the McNeil station, and if the McNeil station, as Jason said, like if the Connecticut rec market falls through the floor, electrical generation no longer is cost viable, but they have a dedicated interest in doing a district heating system. I mean, that site can be used for providing the thermal energy at a much, much smaller scale than the electrical generation. So I don't want to have anything taken out of here that would preclude scenarios of the option to do it with district heating. But still pursuing the planned contingency plan for the electrical generation.
The sentence that starts, an expansion of electricity production, assumes the answer of the study, the way it's worded. And so I would like to suggest that when it should read, an expansion of electricity production for the viability of the thermal application must be considered, conducting a life cycle analysis which would clearly determine whether the GHG emissions, et cetera, not demonstrate that, but determine whether.
Let's try those. Jane tries them.
Otherwise, you're assuming the answer is, you're saying, we're going to do a study to prove X, rather than we're going to do a study to find out if X is true.
Yep.
Yeah, that's a good change.
Yep, Jason.
And if I may, I mean, the science of life cycle greenhouse gas emission accounting is, I think, in a word, fraught. And there are competing models, some of which are advanced by industries, some of which are advanced by others. And depending which assumptions or baselines or models one uses, we get wildly different and divergent outcomes. And so hanging our hat on a life cycle analysis, I think just sort of moves, if you will, the conversation and the argument and the battle, if you will, into a room of technical experts. And it doesn't, in fact, really change the GHG or toxic air pollutant outcomes that would be borne by the folks who live around and on planet Earth. And so, although I understand and can respect the interest in looking at a life cycle analysis, if we set it up in this way, basically be the key to answering this question, we then are also setting ourselves up for a scenario in which we get an outcome that is very favorable for continuing combustion, we can expect vociferous opposition. And if we get a result that says otherwise, we can expect vociferous opposition. And so I don't know that we are setting ourselves up for success here by hanging our hat on this, frankly, from like a policy perspective, from messaging perspective, from just a moving forward as a state perspective.
Jane, when is the life cycle analysis expected?
Well, the contract hasn't even been signed yet, and that's not, that's a state administration capacity issue, so I won't get into that. But it, first, and as I spoke to last time, it hasn't, I don't want to poke fun at our shortcomings as a state around bureaucracy, but I will say that, you know, the process to have a collaborative outcome of an RFP development and then selecting a contractor, those kinds of components that we're building into a process now to be more transparent in our decision making adds significant time to developing the contract, months. But we selected the vendor in September, and we've just had significant back and forth around determining deliverables and payment and details of that. And I just got it sent back to me yesterday with additional asks of me. So we are so close, but I expect I have to redo the timeline now.
Jane,
based on that.
a question for you is but is the life
It was
cycle
supposed to
analysis?
be end of the fiscal year. That was a long-winded answer, so June, but I'm not sure if that is still.
But is that life cycle analysis work? That's not specifically tasked to analyze thermal expansion of, Rygate. That's a statewide
Yeah, of all energy use.
So would that be able to do what's asked of you, that contractor, or is it something different?
Colin can probably speak to it a little bit, but it will give us a tool and a framework that we could build upon for more specific analyses. It's not specific to me.
It would not be specific to McNeil, and I don't know. Yeah,
It's included in it because it's an energy use.
right. It would probably not include anything about like a thermal expansion, but it might provide, like Jade said, emission factors that you could use to come up with an answer. But without having the final product, I kind of hesitate to say what exactly you could or could not do. But if it could probably be a building block to get the answer we needed at least.
So other thoughts about this paragraph? I think Les pointed out the last one was important. I think Chase has pointed out potentially the risk of recommending this. That we have some, but not really full resources to do this at this time. I'm just not sure what do people want to do with this paragraph. I'll be coming, I promise.
Can we tease out an initial suggestion, Pat, about incorporating this type of study into the provisions that were up above in paragraph, was it 3?
Yeah, let's go above the 3, maybe take a look to see if there's any ways we can just fold that in.
So overwhelming for me.
Well, I think eventually if we pull it this in a way, it would help kind of
That's a great suggestion.
like separate out different points, because there's a lot there, but I think they're all. I mean, I guess for me, the stuff outlined in what we're looking at below gets to that question that still lingers for me a little bit around substitution and like, what are we substituting, and are we sure that the substitutions are going to get us where we want to go, avoid leakage and all that. So I do see that rolled into these recommendations, but I go back to that question of, I mean, like, we know we want to eliminate, reduce the impacts that we're seeing. We don't want that to come at a cost of increased negatives or leakage elsewhere, so that collectively we're making a net good. Does that make sense?
You say leakage.
I mean, like, I look at it narrowly and broadly. I mean, like, if we're going to be reducing here but ramping up wind on, indigenous lands and for Hydro-Quebec, or if we're going to be creating all these batteries which are opening even more silica mines down in South America. I mean, that's what I wrestle with in terms of like, what are we replacing things with, and what are the impacts of that in terms of both carbon emissions, impacts to land, ecology, communities. And that's kind of where I go back to this question, and I don't even want to reopen it, but this idea of if, because like, personally, I don't know if we've actually gotten to the point where we're like, all right, we've got that set. Like, we know what the alternative is, and we've done the accounting to know that we're going to come out to the point we want to be.
I hear you. The thing that hangs me up on it is that the scientific community has pretty much answered that already. And so I hear what you're saying about the alternatives and figuring those out, but electric generation with biomass, as far as the scientific consensus goes right now, it's a foregone conclusion.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with that. My if is more, it's almost like there's two questions here. Like, I think we have consensus that this is not the most efficient, best thing to do from emissions, all these kinds of things. The second question is, what are we replacing it with? And I guess I just want to make sure that whatever we replace it with is better than what we've got. So I'm not disagreeing that, like, aspirationally, yes, we do want to stop the harm that's occurring. The question for me is, what's the replacement? I'm still not clear in terms of, do we know that we have those set up in a way where we can do that to come out of this in a completely positive direction?
But
Something up above that address that. Phase up of replacement.
Judy I wanted Judy had a comment, trying to get into some.
Yeah. I'm pretty certain what the replacement is, reduction. I've been saying it at every meeting. We don't reduce. We don't start reducing. We're just gonna have a demand, meet the demand with technology, have another demand, meet it with new technology.
Yeah.
And we can't wait for the technology. We have to reduce.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I guess again, I think yes, and right, like we do need to reduce. Can we reduce quickly enough to the point we need to without having some sort of substitutions come in the meantime, right?
So where is reduction in this document?
I think that's a great point to add, that like, that's a good thing you need to add to it.
I mean, you could, when you say phase up, you could say the phase up of alternatives. Alternatives could be reduction, renewables, et cetera. So right now, the phase up is very specific to making an assumption versus just phase up of replacements would be essentially could include efficiency or reduction.
And I guess that maybe you just kind of simply said what I'm trying to say, that we almost say it as an assumption of like, we know how to do that. And I'm not sure we do know how to do that yet. And so I just want to make sure that that's built into here in terms of how are we in that study? How are we going to do this?
So here's a thought on this thing when you talk about 4B2 is that because it's actually a separate question around thermal, separate from the specifics of the electricity led ones. Is I don't know whether we have a few folks working on language for paragraph 3. We can think about the language from 4A somehow getting fed into here in a much simpler version, and we could try to come back next week with that paragraph cleaned up and explicated. I'm not sure what else we might do at this point, especially given the time. I want to make sure we at least talk about 4B.
I'm not ready to talk about 4B right now. I want to say something I always say in my classes. We have been raised to adapt to social, political, environmental, and economic changes. That's why we've been here so long. We have adapted. And if we don't accept, if we don't adapt to the fact change has to happen, we're screwed. We are screwed. And that's what this needs to reflect. Change has to happen.
I'm thinking about how to include 4A into 3, and if we're saying if is removed from 3, then I don't think you can roll 4A into it because you're saying you're closing the plant and we're just planning for that. To then study the add-on thermal component, you can only merge those or keep them in the same document if is still there. Because there's no need to study a thermal add-on if your plan is to mothball the plants. Those are contradictory recommendations.
Although,
so I just want to like draw that out, that if we're trying to merge them, the only way you merge them is if you put if back in there. If everyone is ardently against if, then I'm not sure what we do with 4A.
Although I do think the plan idea is important, at least from my perspective, from this idea that eventually, whether it's tomorrow or 100 years from now, hopefully it won't be, like we're going to need to see a transition. And so I think that the plan, even if it's put back, I do like the idea of a plan to think about, when the time comes, how do we make these transitions? So
I think the thermal piece should be part of it, but I don't think you can include 4A into 3.
Yeah, I agree with your point there. Yeah.
So I just want to note, I think a fundamental difference in this group is this. I think for those people who think the biomass plant should be closed soon, and we need to prepare for that, but they need to be closed soon. And those I think are not going to close them soon until they know a lot more. And so I think there are people who come to the conclusion, it's not really an if statement, it's a how and when statement, and when should be sooner. I think we have a group of folks who are not comfortable with even with the if yet, because they don't know all the implications of doing so. And I just think that's what the group is for that.
I'm not sure.
Liz is heading.
Yeah, I don't want to go. Liz, go ahead and then Chase.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Patrick, not adopting the summary you just made, but going back to what Adam's, I think it was Adam's voice that I heard. I just agree with what he said. And that was part of my concern on dropping the if we're going to do a study. And, you know, yeah, fundamentally, I don't know if I adopt the way you just summarized it. For me, it's, I believe we heard, at least I heard, you know, and I took in from the work that we've done that there may be opportunity with respect to the thermal transition and usage of that facility. And I mean opportunity on kind of, you know, potentially more than one axis, right? That's why we're looking at economic as well as GHG and other factors. So if we are open to that, then I very much think it needs to be reflected in the document. It was reflected pretty much in the first version, but I definitely have seen throughout these conversations today a movement away from that. So I would not support or could not join as a consensus model a draft that kind of had a foregone conclusion that any thermal usage there, you know, wouldn't be something that could be potentially used, because I think I've heard that it could be actually beneficial on more than one axis, including environmental. I'll stop.
So a quick, just one idea, and I'm going to go to Chase and Judy, is a quick fix it for a, given what Adam just said, you could say regardless of the phase out electricity production, thermal expansion would be explored for these reasons, right? So you could, there's something like that you could potentially put in. Chase.
Can you tease that out a little bit and make sure it impact what I'm thinking? How would that look? Just hypothetically.
You're asking me?
I guess, or whoever wants to.
Or Liz, yeah, I don't know whoever wants to explain.
If that's Chase, I can't hear him. I'm sorry.
The question is, Liz, I think the question is, if you were to say that you stopped producing electricity at the McNeil plant, how would the thermal kind of operation alone work? Is that?
Yeah. I'm not technically able to answer that, and not sure that it's. I'm not the right person to ask that question. Certainly, if there's questions like that, directing them to the facilities would be the right thing to do.
Adam wanted to get back. So
I mean, everything that's been looked at has been the waste heat recovery, but like, you know, there are certain ways that thermal energy could be generated on a site where there is an electrical generator. I mean, like the Montpelier district heating plant. So there are models of decoupling the electrical generation and the thermal generation. So my concern with all this is, yeah, it's great. You can utilize low-grade waste heat, and that's a low-cost input that justifies all the capital costs to run pipe up to, you know, the campus of UVM and the hospital. But yeah, I mean, like we could have a thermal only plant here, and it'd probably burn, you know, 20,000 tons instead of 400,000 tons. That could be done. I would like to see that left on the table. I just don't think you would actually see anything happening if you don't have a waste source. But the reality is, we have a 40-year-old plant that, like, who knows how long it'll be operating.
Right.
I just don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and so I think that there is a weird, interconnection here that it's kind of hard to decouple them entirely. But I think that we should be considering language and recommendations that achieve the desire to reduce the amount of inefficient generation of electrons, but still be supportive of a good, alternative.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Go ahead.
Now, Judy, you had a question coming on to make.
I don't have a question. I don't get any of this. We've been talking for 8-9 months about protecting our forests and all the amount of trees that are cut down on a daily basis to feed McNeil and Rodgate. And if it's not electricity, if it's heat, we still have to feed it. What about the carbon storage? What about taking our forests and just keep feeding it to these machines? And we cannot talk about heat expansion at McNeil without getting into the archaeological resources. We cannot talk about that.
It's the same issues you're saying.
Yeah. It's exactly the same. And I'm starting to be the greeter of doom, but we don't have time on this planet for this. We all agreed that we wanted to get rid of it, with the exception of Liz. She didn't wanna, we all agreed we wanted that first thing she said she would move forward if was there. We all agreed. Now we're debating again about heat. Come on, we gotta move forward. Enough is enough. Look at the past, look at our forests and what will happen. Look to the future and what will happen to the planet if we continue to debate this for decades.
So partly to Judy's point, the second bullet relates more broadly to thermal expansion for, wood for thermal broadly across the state, just knowing there's a lot more work to be done. It's kind of what it says, but Richard, go ahead.
Just to step back a bit, one could ask, what alternatives does the University of Vermont have for campus district heat? And is this the best alternative for them to achieve that objective from an environmental and cost perspective?
And perhaps add to that too, would they be comfortable citing a combustion facility on their campus where they would bear directly the burdens of the emissions? Or are they only comfortable with it if it is cited in a
Far
lower
away.
income, historically marginalized community? It's a very real consideration that perhaps gets glossed over. And if we put the burdens and the benefits in the same place, perhaps then the cost benefit calculus changes somewhat in the eyes of decision makers.
UVM could build an industrial scale ground to water or ground to air heat pump system, geothermal heat pump system on some of the land that they have.
But they're not only talking about UVM, Richard, they're talking about the medical center as well.
So I'm aware of the time. It's 11:30. We provided a chance. We want to provide another chance for public comment, which I'll be conscious of. So I think, unless anybody has any quick final comments on this, let's pause for a second, take public comment, and kind of assess where we are. So any other quick comments from the task group on this for now? We're not done. So there's a lot of questions here. Okay, why don't we do public comment again? If we could start in the room, and then if folks could come to the table to make the public comment to be heard. If one of the public comment, just raise your hand. I know folks want to make one. Okay, Cheryl, Joy in the room, and then anybody on the screen want to make a public comment, just raise your hand so I know it's coming, and then we'll get the mic over there. Sorry. I'll just put it
Thank So we're talking, I'm glad that Judy brought up the fact about no more time left to be doing things. I've brought that up in the past also. We've done enough studies, we know what needs to be done. And this whole group is backing away over and over on some strong points that they made and now backing away from it. One thing that I keep also bringing up is adding in, there's nothing in this document about environmental impacts. There's health, archaeological, industry, logging industry, just transition, etc. But and climate, of course. But the impacts to habitat and biodiversity from biomass burning, no matter what it's for, whether it's for electricity or heat, is just as important to us as climate and health impacts. We can't, if we save save down to 1.5 or even 2, that's not going to help us if we don't have the biodiversity out there also supporting us. We can't save one and throw the baby out with the bathwater. All of the harvest that's going on is impacting greatly biodiversity. We focus on various things for biodiversity, such as, things that certain interest groups are interested in, hunting, birding, etc. But we're not focusing on what was here originally which was a lot of interior forest. We don't have any old forest here anymore. The oldest forest is like, I don't know, 150 or 60 years old, and that's ancient compared to most of it in the state. And, you know, certain species don't even start to come in until the forests are like, you know, 200 years old. And so we're not talking about biodiversity anywhere and habitat anywhere in here, and we need to. I don't know where it belongs. It doesn't belong in the health part, but it should be added to the studies. The actual goal of the biomass task group from forever ago was to look at the combustion of biomass and to talk about changing. Well, I've heard you guys, I think I've heard you guys talk about having another group focusing on biomass burning for heat. I can't remember exactly when that was, but there was talk about recommending this group to continue to address heat. But I just think
That's in the 4B that we haven't gotten to yet.
okay. I just want to say over and over and over again, habitat and biodiversity back in or into it. We got to think about biodiversity and our water, and which is also being impacted. So those are just as equally important as climate. And there's no time left. There's no time left. You can't do things that are going to take more months. You just have to just go for it. Make a statement. There's no time left.
Let me go to, I think Annette Smith had her hand up. Annette, you go ahead and make a public comment.
Yes, thank you. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I haven't been able to follow along this meeting this morning, but I am aware of the recommendations, and I have two observations based on my extensive following of this biomass task group as a member of the public. The first is that we have learned through this work that more than half of the wood that's being burned at Reigate and McNeil, it comes from out of state. So I wonder if this group would consider in the interim, as a part of the phasing out of the plants, to limit the amount of wood burned in Vermont to wood harvested in Vermont, which would seem to perhaps support McNeil and not Reigate. I've been aware of the legislative discussions about Reigate and their contract extensions. I've testified several times on that. I'm aware of the bankruptcy proceedings for Stort Solar, the owners of the Reigate plant. And the whole rationale, aside from providing baseload electricity, is to support the loggers. The loggers are now being harmed, as they have put into the case at the PUC over the Reigate contract. And it's all spun as though we're burning sustainably harvested wood. But if more than half of it's coming from Vermont, and this task group has not looked at the harvesting practices for the other states, primarily New York, New Hampshire, and some's coming from Massachusetts and Connecticut too, couldn't this group recommend limiting the burning of trees to those harvested sustainably in Vermont as a part of leading to phasing out? That's my first comment. My next comment has to do with the, frankly, the absolute joke of using the thermal heat from these plants. That was a condition or a promise of the McNeil plant in its initial CPG 40 years ago. That was considered in the first CPG for Reigate, and then discussed, this would be, I think, in 1989, and that it wasn't going to happen. And now they're coming back saying, oh, we're going to do something with it, like build another biochar plant. These promises result in them taking more public money for subsidies. Supposedly, McNeil has something going on right now that's a result of millions of dollars more public money going into this thermal dream. Well, is it going to happen or isn't it? But shut the door on it. This is it. If it's not going to happen, it should stop. So those are my comments. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you. Any other public comment from anybody? Okay, Jane.
Well, if you will indulge me for a minute, while we were talking, I'm sorry, I have a lot of things.
Let's go
I
camp.
just shared my screen so everybody can see it. This is probably not do it right, but just to try to move the needle, I did take components of 4A, and you'll notice Charlie was starting to allude to, there's so many components of the study, we probably want to bullet it out. So I tried to bullet it out, it's hard for me to adjust the language so it reads clearly with all the track changes, but we can do that. But then added in, it actually, in my mind, by adding it in here, makes it so it's not specific review only for life cycle and only for thermal, but it actually sort of starts to get at sort of a comprehensive approach to like certain criteria that you're calling out that should all be looked at as in whole. So I added it in as a bullet for your all consideration. I can just as quickly delete it, but it's one spot that you could do that and then do away with 4A below. And focus 4 as more the study of how we treat thermal application outside of electricity.
Adam, you're saying yes. Other folks, again, we can mess with the language more, but curious about that approach.
I think it should be deleted,
Which should be deleted.
the whole sentence.
The bulk. What about 4A?
Well, if we're gonna have the first sentence of this section say, a plan to close it exists, then we can't tickle their funny bone by saying, well, maybe it can if you do heat. We have to consider our forests. We have to consider our people and the health conditions.
So Jen, if you have a thought, I mean, one other option is to just treat sort of thermal as a separate issue, and to Adam's point, say regardless of whether the plant, regardless of electricity production at that particular plant, if thermal were to proceed, it needs to be investigated for these reasons, and it's just part of the thermal story in 4 versus trying to fold it into 3 here. But I think either way is all options for moving forward. So Jane, anything else on that? I just want to.
Why do you feel it's options for moving forward either way?
For you right now, you're saying you want to take it out of here, figure out 4. So I would say for 4, maybe we can do it.
No, I want to take it out of here, and I don't want to address the expansion of heat for heat or heat at all.
So do you want to be, does that mean you would ask the group to see if they would reach consensus on supporting no thermal expansion? Okay, and we can test it in a minute here. So, all right, let's do that. Let's actually study aside for a minute. Let's talk about the proposition. So Judy's put forward a proposition that, to this group would say, we do not support expansion of McNeil on the thermal side, regardless of whether or not there's electricity, right? You're saying no use of essentially wood.
Because we don't even know what changes. We don't know the greenhouse gas emissions. We don't know the impacts on the people. We don't know how much wood it's going to take. I think Darren said it was going to be a 4% increase in fuel. So that's more trees, that's more emission going out into the air. Why do we want more?
So other folks, I think Judy's saying no thermal expansion of McNeil regardless of electricity side. Richard?
I'm listening to Judy, and it's making me think that you tried to address this out, but is it feasible to use the existing plant to generate heat without generating electricity? But the whole idea of it is that the heat that would be used now is waste heat from the electricity generation. If there's no electricity generation, there's no waste heat. So how does this make sense?
That's right.
Solar panels on the roof.
Well, they had talked about, and I was looking at that map because there used to be an older map that showed it. They were talking about two big, huge things that held the steam that was coming out of the smokestacks, and that's what they would shoot up the hill. But either way, it's expansion.
Which you're opposed, right? Just be clear. So, again, I think I'm not quite sure how to frame the question here, given where we're at with this. Some people I think would want to study it. Others, I think some folks are saying it shouldn't happen. So we're just saying, if we're not gonna do electricity, I don't know how it would happen. I don't know, we have all the technical skill set in the room. So again, thoughts on the way forward here. I think we've got to.
My thing in this is, I mean, the optimal design consideration that Evergreen engineers presented on, there's an increment of additional fuel use and how they were going to do that to meet the loads of the medical center and the campus. But so our recommendation says additional wood and expansion, but like there are scenarios under which waste heat could be used to meet a portion of the load up there without that increment. And so I would just ask that we have explicit understanding of our words, that if we're saying, if the line that we're drawing in the sand is, we're saying just no expansion, no additional increment of fuel consumed to meet a thermal load, then that leaves the option on the table to go back to the drawing boards, do the engineering to utilize waste heat without that increment of additional fuel. So I just want to make, I'm not saying either way, I'm just saying let's be super clear and intentional with our words.
Yep.
So Adam, I'm not sure if you heard Annette speak, that has been on their applications since they existed.
Oh, I'm all
And over and over again, they try a different angle, and there's a roadblock. They haven't figured it out.
well,
Are
it's
we
mostly
gonna-
been natural gas pricing has been the biggest barrier to historical expansion of the industry.
And archaeology. And so if they're gonna have these hurdles, are we gonna waste time allowing it to continue? For another 40 years,
Again,
20
I'm
years,
not-
whatever it
I'm
was.
not advocating for any specific thing, I'm just saying, let's just be clear what we're saying, because that's.
So
says
can I just add a clarifying question? Because I appreciate the archaeological concerns and I don't want to, I'm not discounting it at all. Is there a current study going on related to the archaeological resources or attributes or values in relation to the expansion? I know there's been like a lot of studies done.
There
but
have been studies as to where they were gonna put the steam tanks down.
Because I thought we heard from somebody that presented that they're currently doing work looking at the impacts that we're talking about. And I don't know if I misheard that or if it's not an ongoing study or if it's been done.
Well, I drive that road all the time and I don't see any work being done. But I know there was that work done where the steam tanks were proposed to go.
Just a question for permitting of, if they were to actually file for permits for expansion, which they've not, I believe, done yet, they would have to go through sort of a 106 cultural resources consultation as part of their permitting process, correct?
Which could conceivably 3 different phases, which could be decades.
So whether they've done one or not currently, they would have to do one if they apply for actual permits. Just wanted to clarify that just for a fact. Is that right? Megan?
I'm actually not sure. You were nodding yes, Jane, that they would have to.
I
do
think-
cultural-
I can't imagine that they wouldn't have to do comply with section 106. You don't think so?
I mean, that's a federal provision, right?
State, there's a state.
There's a
It's
state.
delegated to state,
Okay.
I think.
Yeah.
That's the way it works.
Wouldn't there be federal money coming into the project?
Yeah.
This is doing all that anyway.
If there were federal money coming in, then yeah.
Yeah. Can't imagine they're going to do this without federal money that would trigger.
Yeah, right. And then there's, I mean, to say nothing of the fact that they would need a revised CPG and a permit from the Air Division, which is like, I just want to point out, I've been kind of holding my tongue because I feel like this is, and I missed the last couple of meetings, I don't know if you've already talked about this, but all of these analyses that you're discussing will come to light in any permitting process at the PUC or within A&R. So all this information will have to be brought to bear in those decisions as well.
And that's my point exactly. Do we have time for this?
Chase, did you have a comment?
I just wanted to tease out something that I think I heard Adam say earlier today. You know, the plant itself is quite old and, you know, realistically probably doesn't have a whole lot of additional years left in it. At least in its current sort of, it's currently operating. And so if a large investment is in fact made for a criminal application, and then the plant itself struggles to continue, then what? After that, enormous financial investment. What are we burning? Are we still burning wood?
Yeah.
Are we burning natural gas? Are we burning something else? How much of it are we burning? Like, there are just, at this point, I mean, the facility is frankly old. So there's just, there are a whole lot of uncertainties here that could be very troubling.
I have a concern too about why would we want to go to natural gas, which is a fossil fuel?
So I think this is where I think now we're like, I think we're close to many of these, but this is where we're a little bit wrapped around the axle. I can't, I'm sure maybe it's late in the morning, so I can't quite see our way forward on this. I think we've got some work to do on 3 we already talked about, which is good. I think this one, we may have to kind of do a little thinking between now and next meeting for some options that come forward or ideas. Jane, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, because I'm aware we're kind of out of time, so for today.
I mean, I would recommend that, because Judy, I'm only hearing you right now voice striking it completely. So I guess I would like to talk that through and see if more people are aligned with Judy on that, because then that would be one path, is we just take it off the table. And then if there's not agreement on that, the next path would be, like, I would like to say, like, you could have 3 options. You could have a bullet in the number 3. You could have a retooling of 4A that leads with thermal application rather than a vision of how it's compatible with electricity, like actually retell the story from a thermal application perspective, because that's what 4B is, and sort of frame it in that way. Or continue in a similar vein and just rework.
Or take 4A, incorporate it in 3 and just include the word if.
Yes.
Which kind of solves one. Because we're commissioning a study. Just slightly broadens that scope to include the thermal expansion and to evaluate that with the critical eye to peer review commission study. It's already looking at all those other issues.
It wouldn't actually be peer reviewed, though, would it?
I'm sorry, I can't remember what language qualifiers we use.
Fancy for the state.
I think we used peer review in one of the other records, so I apologize.
I'm trying to think, I mean, maybe just test the quick proposition, so I get this right. The proposition is no expansion of McNeil for thermal heat, essentially for thermal heat production, regardless of electricity. I'm just curious how people say that, if people could agree with just, we should just not do sort of thermal heat production at the McNeil plant.
Let's tease that apart.
Yeah.
No expansion for thermal or no thermal. Because there may be a scenario where you can do it as is or less than. I want to make sure that we tease this to that.
Does it, realistically though, does that scenario still exist after the extensive permitting process? McNeil might at that point be about 50 years old. Like, is there, like, really?
I can't tell you from an engineering standpoint, but I would say if we're doing a study to look at how best to optimize a phase out, putting that in there and studying it would be the best way to do it. And I don't want to exclude the potential for something that could be beneficial. And if you don't know yet, then we'll study.
Richard.
The way you frame the question doesn't allow for the possibility that some of the existing plant would be used for thermal application in absence of electricity generation.
That's what I want to make sure.
That's correct.
I mean, my view is that the whole plant should be raised and salted, and the ground should be salted so that it doesn't ever rise up again.
But
that's not where we're at.
We could keep happy.
I mean, the water quality impacts of that much salt down there would be, I don't know.
No, Richard, I mean, I cannot honestly sit here at this table and think that I want to endorse something that's gonna use a fossil fuel to survive.
So
What would be the fossil? Just to-
Natural gas.
For what?
If this engine to black is converted to natural gas and also been used, I guess you could.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that was the assumption in terms of thermal.
I think there's just, I don't know that it's necessarily assumption, it's just an open question. Because McNeil is so old, if it can no longer operate as an electricity generation facility, but we're then relying upon that operation for the waste heat, then what? We're
But
just,
not to mention too, in their backyard is the main plant for the natural gas. They purposely installed it right there in their backyard. You
Wait,
go up-
for their use,
Yeah,
not to distribute.
right. So it's 100, you just gotta walk 100 feet, it's right there.
So it seems like we're kind of, I mean, I don't disagree with like the negative implications of what we're discussing, but it seems to me like we're starting to kind of go a little bit farther down different roads that we don't really know enough about to go down those roads yet, which is why I go back to the study, and the study kind of saying, this is what we need to know to inform these decisions. And I'm 100% good putting guardrails on things, thou shalt not go down this path unless these conditions are met kind of thing. But I do worry that sometimes, although we're going a little bit down those roads without understanding exactly like if that is the path that would happen, or if like that would be the outcome of X.
So it could be that this, again, we'll still get to whether what we do with the word if, but you could have as one of the things is to understand essentially that as part of your study for understanding phase out is what are the implications for essentially using that some portion of that plant for thermal heat only and all of its implications, forests, people, cultural resources, missions, all those things.
Fossil fuels.
Fossil fuels, you could put all that in a bullet under that one as part of that story. I think we'd have to write it between now and next. And be part of the story of phase out. Sharp, I like that term. All right, I'm aware of the time. I think we have not discussed, the two things we have not discussed yet, which we'll have to go back to see what the cleaned up version looks like of what we have done, especially 3, where we've done a lot of work that we haven't quite closed. 4B is about thermal broadly, kind of saying what work needs to be done. I think it's kind of what it says. And then 5, we've not talked about either, which is really around, I think, more of the overall Vermont kind of analysis or accounting. Part of the kind of comment that was made.
Can I just say, is the consensus to delete this from here and try to rework 4A to be around thermal application and have the sidebars that we were just starting to get at?
I think I don't think we know yet.
Okay. I really want to know. I'm trying to push it.
I think what Charlie's suggesting as part of phase out, we need to understand, and which he's suggesting goes into 3A, is as part of expansion, if you were to just keep it for thermal alone, is that feasible one? And if it is, what are the impacts that would result from?
That's what I thought. Right. Taking 4A, putting it into 3, and just put ifs in there. Does that study as part of 3 if there's no if?
Yeah.
And I can support.
Okay.
Are we putting a pin in this now, or is this sort of what we're not gonna vote on?
I think we should vote on it.
No,
No?
I
Just,
think-
how about just not vote on it, but just on process on how to move it to next week? Because that's what, do we agree? I just want to know if it's worth working it into 3 and taking.
I think it would take too long.
What if,
Jason?
I don't know, this idea, could you scroll back down, please? What if we were to keep the words in that first sentence, any expansion, and then where it says investigate the end of the sentence, just delete everything that follows?
Delete everything that follows what? Sorry, Jason.
Just
say that I'm already not making it. I'm just trying to think. Never mind, I retract that.
Yeah, I think we do, Jane. I think probably in talking, we got Charlie's gonna help us with some other language for part 3. I think maybe Jane if you and I talk some more, we can give out a few options for some people, like we've heard the range of ideas, we strike it all together, we put it in 3, we try to concoct something for 4. And so we've got all those things kind of on the table, we're gonna have to probably put forward in a clear way. I don't think one direction entirely today.
Jane, can you put a comment on the side when you're making all the comments? To remember what Cheryl suggested about adding things about the land and
Like biodiversity, habitat, water.
yeah.
Jane, I know, any more pushing for trying to get more clarity before we close?
Well,
Yes.
equity value added. Yeah, but where you just read.
Well, I just want to talk through what we're going to do next week. So that the agenda can be corrected correctly. So we're clearly not, I happen to think dealing with the findings and the opening section is like, that can come after, like, that's really not, it's really about the recommendations are the most important component right now. And I do feel like, so the subcommittees, I want to check in with you all and see how you'd like to handle the meeting next week with subcommittees being invited, and ask, the council agenda is being crafted for the following week. And we were putting on that council agenda the sort of update to the council on the recommendations that weren't able to be given in October, in hopes that we were still moving towards an addendum for adoption of these recommendations at the December council meeting. But we can't do that in December if we haven't previewed the recommendations in November. So I guess I just want to ask, like, is it time to call that timeline and pull it? Or do we keep working towards it? And yeah. So we can bring the recommendations. The council doesn't want to see the recommendations until the subcommittees have considered them.
So Jane, here's my second group, we will definitely need, via Zoom, we'll need, just among this task group, we'll at least need next week to see if we can come to a close on the recommendations. And then we'll need the full time.
Yes.
That we have, which doesn't leave time then for subcommittee reaction and feedback. So I think that's where we are, which means it'd be very hard to do, unless we wanted to concurrently go to the council and the subcommittees get feedback to the council at that time. I don't see how, if we're gonna sequence them, I don't see how we want to do that.
Just from a process standpoint, isn't this the opportunity for subcommittee involvement? Like, I thought we basically said, we're opening these meetings up now. If you want to have a say or some access, do it now. I mean, I'm just worried that if we're gonna, okay, so.
Yes, I agree. And we can just handle it that way next week too. But I know like TJ, who's co-chair of cross sector, had comments that he wanted to make, and he's refraining from interjecting his voice until this group reaches consensus. So I had hoped that by next week we would have had recommendations, and then we could really hear outside voices in.
During that, okay, I got you.
And so we can just say that they've been listening in on the process, and that's been open, and I can sort of, I mean, Liz, I sort of ask you, we have an extended steering committee meeting next week where we're going to review the council agenda, and we can check in on biomass at that steering committee meeting and say, we're likely going to have draft recommendations. And the subcommittees have been invited into 2 of those meetings, but we have not had the capacity to incorporate feedback from those subcommittees as of yet. Do we want to bring these recommendations to the council in November or hold? And I'll tell you that my consternation lies in that I'm not sure what the council is going to do in 2023 yet for a schedule. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, you don't get on December, we'll go to January. There's a push from some councilors to meet much less frequently in 2023, and what that schedule is, I don't know what it will be yet.
I mean, Liz, I don't know what you think is that, I mean, my sense is the best we can do where we're at is a full task group meeting, subcommittees listening in next week. Then if you all want to go to the full council the following week, it could be the task group saying it's finding, subcommittee has listened and heard all this, certainly could make their additional remarks to the council at that time. I think if you don't parallel process, I don't know. But
yeah, well, we may, I think the purpose of the subcommittee meetings jointly held invited today and then conducted next week was to get some feedback. So we may hear next week. I know it's closer in time to the actual council meeting, but I don't know exactly what we'll hear from the subcommittees next week. If there is, for example, wide general consensus on what we've come up with so far, then that makes it easier, even if there's not a fully complete document, to go ahead and share it at the council. Whereas if it's the opposite and there's a lot of questions and issues raised, then it might be the opposite. So I don't know if I can handicap it until we see the result.
I mean, Jamie, how many time do we have for the night? Do we have an hour and a half, or do we have 2 hours?
We have 2 hours, so I guess that was another thing floating through my mind. I hate to say this out loud to all of you who have given so much, but we could an hour and just know that we have an hour and a half for task group discussion and an hour for subcommittee comments, and then the other time dedicated to public comment throughout.
So we could do that, right? We could really try to get our work done in an hour and a half. So thereabouts, and then subcommittee could respond to public comment when we close to see where we are. Liz, how does that, as a council member, how does that sound? Are people willing to, are you still thinking about 3 hours, 2.5 hours? What are you thinking?
Well, I'll just say 3 hours, no, seeing how things go. But that's for you all to consider.
Okay, promise of breaking it up. And this would be online, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, right, just because people travel long ways today. All right, so unless people are gonna argue differently, that's probably what we should go for. Next week, 8:30 to 11:30 would be 3 hours, or is it, it'd be 8:30, right?
Yep.
8:30 to 11:30, about half dedicated just to task group work to try to close with some work between now and then subcommittee comment and conversation. We'll see where we are. We'll find time.
So I'll just flag, I'll get the stuff I said I would write up for recommendations, but I'm have an unavoidable conflict next week, so I won't be around.
So Joe, can you get those to us?
Yeah, I can try to get them this week too.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
And what we'd like to do is get out another draft before next week, so we can look at whatever final, whatever red line piece there is left. Okay.
We'll need an 8-hour council meeting also.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody on the phone. Really appreciate it. We'll be in touch next week. Thank you all who came today as well in person.
Thanks
all.